Hello, everyone. Hello, 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 hello. If you can see and hear us, please let us know. Also, just because I'm pretty sure you can see and hear us, if any of the mods happen to have caught the super chat that was sitting here last week, I would appreciate it. You would pass that on to me. It's very difficult to find.
This episode has been a long time coming. It was originally planned for the end of December. Oh, you found it. Well done. It was originally planned for the end of December, and we're now all the way into almost the end of January. A lovely mixture of Nurgle plans over the festive periods, and Nurgle kind of got in the way of us finally sitting down and doing what we desperately wanted to do, which was have a pint of Bugmans and have a good discussion about that fabled Dwarf Ranger, that great purveyor of Dwarven brews, Josef Bugman himself. It's been a wee bit of a time getting round to this one.
Yeah, but it's the perfect way to start the new year, even though it was intended to end off the last one.
It really was.
Such is the way of things sometimes.
I'm looking forward to this one quite a lot because Josef Bugman is a character that's slightly close to my heart for a variety of reasons, but we'll get into that when we dive into the old intro.
Yeah, but real quick, I'm gonna knock out both of these. Oh, my collar's all like funky. Super chats before we get into it because both of them, funny enough, have nothing to do with today's stream. So I'm just gonna kill them before we even get started.
Perfect one, and that's a good opportunity for us to say, as always, if we have super chats coming in, which we inevitably will do, we'll be taking them in batches. We won't be doing them all as they come in live, because if we do that, we'll just be doing super chats all day rather than talking about the topic of the day, which is, of course, Bugman himself.
Yep. So, Rocker Boy Jukebox on December 10th asked, as hypothetical scenario, how would the Paravan nobility react to the possibility of Kruber legally owning land of the dukedom? I think they would be very much over our dead bodies, without emphatic proof. Now, granted, if the lady had appeared to him like she does in the Vermintide End Time scenario and made him into a Grail Knight, that would probably have a rather dramatic impact on things, but that would only really happen in an End Time scenario, so...
Yeah, it's very easy for us to get caught up in our fantasy version of how bloodlines work, particularly with Warhammer. But if we take a step back and just think about very loosely how nobility worked back in Europe and then apply parts of that over into the Warhammer world as and where it's appropriate, you'd immediately go, well, surely it would be fine. Bretonia is a bit different to any real world society. It is quite literally a high fantasy piece of craziness, very much based upon Arthurian legends that some may claim are French, but we all know in truth are very, very English. So we are left with this bizarre situation that I think would, as I think Sotek puts it out relatively correctly, not be well accepted unless it had divine, let's say, inspiration behind it, which very well could be the case.
Yep. And then Sean Schultz, what would happen to a human if you brought a Bugman brew back to a dwarf hold? Or would the human try to bring it to his noble? I mean, it probably depend on the human in question. Some might see a dwarf thing and be like, oh, I should return this to dwarves, obviously. And someone else might go, oh, my boss might really like this. I'm going to take this to my boss. So it just, I think, would depend on personality. But whoever got it would probably be very appreciative.
Indeed. And just before we go on to the next one, let me just say, Faba, you haven't missed anything yet. We're just doing a couple of super chats before we go, and we're about to dive into our introduction. So don't worry, nothing missed yet.
Which intro time.
Is it time for intros already? Right. So I'm going to start off by saying something that for a Bugman stream is deeply controversial. I don't like beer. And I know this is a weird way to start, but I don't like beer. If I'm doing a Josef Bugman stream, I feel like I should start with a lovely tankard, pour myself a beer and drink it, but I don't like beer. And I shall give you a couple of examples of direct proof of this. When I was working for Games Workshop a very long time ago, one of the Christmas bonuses that was sent round to everyone pretty much in the company was a big, huge cask, although it was in a cardboard box because, hey, Games Workshop, of Bugman's beer. This is all the way back in about 1990 something. And I received this Bugman beer. Never have you ever drunk a more sedimentary, horrendous beer in your life. It was not Bugman's finest. Let's put it that way. Certainly wasn't Dark Choice or King's Gold, to name a couple of
I would
Bugman's
just
beers.
put that on the collection shelf. Never opened.
It was definitely a thing, and the staff all tried it, and only one of us liked it at the time, and it was Andy Leask, because I knew him all the way back then. I think Andy Leask may actually have been a key timer at that point, which means he might have even been like 17, 18. It was a long time ago, back when I didn't even have a beard. I was a fresh-faced young child. When I eventually, many years later, went to Bugman's Bar when it opened up down in Lenton, I didn't like it then either, when I sampled my first Bugman's beer, because I don't like beer. So I'm going to drink some wine. Not much, but a little bit for this. It's the closest the closest I can get to actually having a Bugman's beer without going. So, where are we going to begin? Now, obviously, I have drunk Bugman's beer on more than one occasion because Games Workshop has created various real-world versions of it. But my first experience with Bugman's predates my first sup of Bugman's by some measure, because Bugman was first added to Warhammer. Now, get this. There's a host of characters in Warhammer that we generally say are really old. They got introduced during the 4th edition of Warhammer, where everything got consolidated. And if you've listened to any of our previous streams, we generally start normally at Warhammer 4th edition, because that's where things like Nagash, Teclis, Tyrion, all manner of characters that we know and love today, and we consider to be pretty much hard-coded into Warhammer, were created. Not Josef Bugman. Oh, no. Josef Bugman was created for Warhammer 1st edition. Now that
good old
is
long
some
beard.
hoary long beard knowledge. And all the way back in, let's go, back in time, back in 1984. The Forces of Fantasy expansion for Warhammer 1st edition introduced the concepts of the Regiments of Renown. And the very first Regiment of Renown that was detailed was Josef Bugman's Rangers. That is some proper old Warhammer lore.
The only 40th anniversary was last year.
Yeah, quite. Now, it's super fascinating because back at this point, the Warhammer world as we know it isn't formed at all. But you'll find that interwoven throughout the very first description of Bugman's Rangers is pretty much everything we end up knowing about him later. It just gets slightly twisted and twisted as time goes by. But there's a few massive differences from this early one that's worth noting as we then go through the editions and discuss where he goes to. Because all the way back then, Bugman, Joseph with a PH, not with an F, just to make sure we're nice and clear there. Joseph. And he's just called Joseph. There's the deep Scandinavian style names for dwarves is yet to be a thing, which is why he's called Joseph in this first time around. His grandfather founded his great brewery, and his grandfather's name was Samuel. At this point,
very
Joseph's
dwarfish.
very dwarfs. Joseph's dad is called Bono, much like he'd just come out of U2. So Joseph's dad, Bono, and his grandfather work in this great brewery. And this brewery is known for creating some of the best dwarven ales that there are. And we don't get where it's properly cited. We just know it's somewhere around the old world. But what we do know is when it is. And this might blow a few people's minds. It was during the Goblin Wars.
Oh my gosh. Yeah.
This is thousands of years in the past in his first iteration. He's a proper old character from the past. But even though it's the Goblin Wars, because this is first edition Warhammer, him and his family are happy to sell to goblins because brass is brass, and they'll sell to anyone as long as they get coin. Because this is early edition dwarves, where even the concept of the great deep vengeance that dwarves have for the goblins and greenskins hasn't really been as consolidated as it will be later. So Josef Bugman is transporting Bugman's brew around the old world into a variety of places, and he, on one fateful occasion, takes a massive consignment up to the Troll Country, where he is selling the brew, presumably, to trolls. Who knows? Indeed, at this point, Troll Brew is his most famous brew, so it's quite likely that Troll Brew is literally being sold to the trolls in the north, because this is Warhammer 1st edition, and things are a bit different back then. But when he comes back home, he finds out that his dad, Odo, that his grandfather, Samuel, and the rest of the entirety of the brewery have been burnt down by goblins, and they have run off with the remaining few survivors. So Joseph swears vengeance, grabs all of his mates together, forms his Rangers, the very first regiment of renown, and says, "That's it, we're off to go and kick them in." He hikes it over the World's Edge Mountains into the Badlands and just starts kicking in greenskins. He does this for an unspecified length of time, but it's a long time, before he eventually returns to the ruins of his brewery and to effectively rebuild it. But when he gets there, the goblins have followed him, they trash the place, and they kill him. The end.
Oof.
Holy shit.
Oof.
It's pretty grim. That
Very
is
grim.
the rather grim tale of Joseph Bugman. But it hasn't actually ended here, because come 2nd edition, it turns out Joseph Bugman's still alive! Woohoo!
His death is greatly exaggerated.
Yeah, absolutely. Come 1985, they release a new Regiment of Renown box set with Joseph Bugman. On the back of it, it's got a tale of an old dwarf arriving at the dwarf hold of Barak Var. And you might go, these sound like names that we know today. Did they exist all the way back in 2nd edition? They were getting made up with each story. And they were slowly but surely going to be patched together as we head towards the 3rd and then the 4th edition of Warhammer. So they arrive in Barak Var, this ancient dwarf, and he comes in and demands to speak to the Dwarf King, and the Dwarf King's like, yeah, nah, but eventually he comes in because he sips at the gift that's given to the king, which is the big casks of ale, and finds out that it's Bugman's. A tear comes to his eye. This is genuine Bugman's. There had been no Bugman's for a generation because Bugman's brewery had been destroyed by goblins. He eventually, to cut a long story, outs himself as Bugman. He didn't die, of course, back at his brewery when he returned to it. He was left for dead by the goblins, and then the tale of him getting from Bugman's brewery down to the hold of Barak Var is apparently so impressive and so awesome that it forms entire sagas. The saga of Joseph Bugman. And this isn't the sagas of him kicking ass after the great destruction of his brewery first time around. This is the saga of him going from the second destruction of his brewery all the way down to there. And this takes years. Apparently years and years and years and years. And by the time he arrives, he's still got beer because he's freaking Joseph Bugman. And he reforms the Rangers, and he reforms them down in Barak Var. But not only does he do this, he also establishes a new brewery down there in Barak Var. And Bugman's brew, for the first time in a generation, starts getting produced again. So Bugman's, the great famous brewer, is produced again. And that's the story that we have in the 1st edition. We can go into more detail on that later if we wish to do so. But it's about to change big time. Because as we have often discussed, when we reach the 4th edition of Warhammer, everything always changes because they established the new version of Warhammer at 4th edition. And in 4th edition, we have the very impressive first stab at making the dwarves what they be, which is the dwarf army list all the way back in, I'm going to guess this one, 1993? 1993. I'm going to go with 3 because it's just before I came down to work for Games Workshop. So 1993, if anyone wants to go check that one up. And at the back of that, we have Joseph Bugman, this time with an F. It's
that
no
is
longer
correct,
PH. Thanks very much.
June 1993.
Oh yeah, I love the army list.
Still got
all the rune rules, they were awesome. So June of 1993, apparently, Joseph Bugman is repurposed, and Joseph is now spelt with an F, and his father is not called, surprisingly enough, Bono. They ditch Bono entirely. They take his grandfather's name, Samuel, and they say, well, you know what? His grandfather wasn't called Samuel at all. He was called Zamnil. Aha! Yes, that's it. His name is Zamnil, because that sounds proper dwarfy. That'll do. His name is Zamnil, and it was Zamnil that built the brewery to begin with. It wasn't his grandfather, but his father instead. And Zamnil was the one responsible for doing it. So we have ourselves a slight change in the background. His name is changed to an F, and Zamnil is now his father. And Zamnil renames himself Samuel so he can better sell to the local Empire folk, the humans that he has now grounded himself with, which completely changes not just who his family are, but massively when they are, because now the Empire exists. And it didn't exist the first time around at all.
No, not even close.
Josef Bugman, however, is dragged screaming through time and dropped down much closer to the modern era of Warhammer. And his father, Zamnil, renames himself Samuel and names his first son Joseph, because obviously that's what you do when you want to continue selling to the Empire folk. There's a nice little slide here saying that he's probably got a Khazad name, but it's not been nailed down, and indeed it will never be. He will be Joseph forever as far as everybody's concerned. So, where the story of what happens to the brewery is not that much different, but it is a little different. This time, instead of going all the way up to Troll Country, Joseph is doing a far shorter hike. He's only making it up towards the capital of the Empire of the time. Most people think it's probably Altdorf, but if it's the date that I'm going to suggest...
Yeah, it's probably Nuln, yeah.
Yeah, very probably, possibly isn't, but we can get into that later. He's off to ship some Bugman special brew to the Emperor, and he's making his way down the River Sol all the way up to the Emperor, and when he's away, the brew house, again, the brewery is attacked and is, cut a long story short, sacked in much the same way as it was the first time, and the story follows exactly the same beats. Joseph comes back, he wails, it's awful, he does a massive oath of vengeance, and then hikes it off into the mountains, over the mountains, into the Badlands, and starts kicking greenskins in. And yeah, that's quite fun. When we reach Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay 1, so first edition here, in 2002, we get Dwarf, Stone, and Steel, and Alfred Nunez was in a position where he had to try and rationalize the different versions of Joseph, and he decided that Joseph was probably 105 years old. So you can take that with a pinch of salt, because later editions are going to make more changes. But at the point of 2002, he's 105 years old in the year 2512, which means come the end times, he'd be about 110, 115, something like that. The other important details that you get from that and this era is that the location of the brewery is nailed in stone, and that's inside the Dwarf Army list in particular, because it's marked on the map and it's down in the depths of Visenland on the River Sul itself. And a little brewery all the way down in the very south of the Empire where they've been selling their Bugmans. And at this point, the Bugman's brews are described, loosely speaking, as some of the best. Not necessarily the best. A paragon, perhaps, of dwarf brewing, but not necessarily something that is the best version of dwarf beer there is. That will, as you're about to find out, change significantly. So, our first edition of Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay adds a few extra details as to the location of the brewery, but tells basically the same story as you get in the army list, so just repeats it. The next time where we get Joseph getting any major advancement is White Dwarf, when Nick Time does himself, I believe it's a set of 4 articles over 4 White Dwarfs, starting at... Okay, it was just before White Dwarf 300 came out, so because I remember 300 having it in it. So it's about 298, 299, somewhere around there, up to 300, up to about 302, where we've got Josef Bugman's brewery and a bunch of scenarios where you can play out the brewery going boom. And this is super fun. If you go check out those articles, and they're around about 298, 299, 300, 301, 302, 303,
and
around that area.
Good at this. 299 Bugman's Lament on page 12.
Thank you. So, brilliant. Okay, so Bugman's Lament. That's it, Bugman's Lament. And that's split over 4 issues of White Dwarf. And there's some great stuff here. There's a big, massive steamship for the dwarves that they convert out completely. We get dwarf flamethrowers. We get goblin pirates. We get sea dogs for the dwarves. There's all manner of crazy stuff. But it does do a couple of extra things that is worth noting. Number one, it directly implies when the brewery went down, because the goblin responsible for burning it all, whose name is Git Guzzler, because of course he has a stupid name, Git Guzzler, wants to be as famous as Grom the Paunch, which means he is definitely post Grom the Paunch. This is important. It's also worth noting that about this time, we get our first references to the fact that Josef Bugman's probably now in command of the entire brewery, where it was his father who was in command in the earlier version. Okay, and now Josef Bugman is pretty much the master brewer, where beforehand he wasn't. He just wasn't. He was a brewer in the Bugman family. Now he's the master brewer and it's all his. And Josef Bugman comes back, and in the rules for Josef, I remember this cleanly at the time because I went, what the fuck? In the rules for Josef Bugman, they say this is before the entirety of his brewery has been burnt down, so he doesn't have animosity to greenskins. And I was like, what? He's a dwarf!
He's like, they're not so bad. They're not so bad.
What? So that was fun. Git Guzzler gets away with it. In the official version, Git Guzzler burns the whole thing down. The same story remains, and the Rangers are formed for Josef Bugman to reclaim the honor that has been lost with the destruction of his family brewery, and he hikes it over to the World's Edge Mountains, goes into the Badlands, and starts kicking in greenskins. This is, you're going to find, an oft-repeated rule when it comes to the history of Josef Bugman. After that, oh cripes, where we go now? Probably 6th edition Warhammer. This is super easy. 6th edition Warhammer, which many people believe may be one of the better editions of Warhammer in general, because it just rebalanced everything. 6th edition Warhammer took the description of Josef Bugman, pressed shift, pressed arrow, pressed Control C, pressed Control V, and popped that into their new version of Josef. So the 6e version pretty much copy pasted what came before and slapped it in and didn't make any major changes at all. Josef Bugman is again described as a paragon of dwarf brewing whose brewery was destroyed by goblins. He swears vengeance to take it down. There's lots of famous brews that he's responsible for, and he then becomes a core figure in the war against greenskins in general, as he pops up here and there, a mysterious figure who will arrive on battlefields whenever greenskins are involved to kick living crap out of them with his Bugman's Rangers. Now, this doesn't mean that the story from the 2nd edition is completely destroyed. It just means that we can incorporate that if we wish to do so, because we've got a section that doesn't make sense, because we know for a fact that Bugman's is still brewed, because we have Bugman's brew popping up all over the place in various games, all over the place, and it's not a hoary brew from the past, it's a consistent thing. So having it still being brewed all the way down in Barak Var, as was described all the way back in 2nd edition, would allow that to all make sense. So it's just worth noting that before we go to the next big one. Which is, as we move into 8th edition Warhammer, our last edition, we get a simplified version of what came before. But it makes some pretty broad and sweeping statements that change his background completely. Because he moves from being a paragon of brewing to being the most famous brewer of all time for dwarfs, possibly the world. Because they really do like their extremely peak descriptions in 8th edition.
So 7th edition is when he gets that epithet.
Are you sure that's 7th?
Yeah, I'm looking at it.
Is it in 7th?
Yeah, I've got it.
Is it a 7th edition
Josef Bugman was the most famous dwarf brewer. Yeah.
Is that 7th? What's the 7th? What's the 7th cover? Which one's the 7th cover?
The 7th cover is the one. It's the one with the dwarf standing on a bunch of a pile of rocks.
The pile of rocks.
Yeah, and he's got his hammer. There's a bunch of dwarfs around him with the banner and the slayer and the orc head on a pipe.
I always forget something. We get there in the end. So what we have now, 7th, 8th, whichever it is a simplified version. His dad's not even mentioned anymore because Samuel no longer matters. All that matters is that he is the master brewer. He is the master brewer that everybody thought was the best brewer amongst all dwarves anywhere ever. And his brewery was sacked by goblins. This sucks. All dwarves lament. All dwarves who loved their Bugman's brew no longer get to have access to it. So thus, if anything, there's another reason to hate greenskins. And the Rangers spread their, let's say, guerrilla warfare tactics against greenskins across the old world. Again, there's nothing here that says we can't go back to the second edition version of the story and have him eventually get beaten at the old site of Bugman's Brewery, and then go down and reform his Rangers in the south. That story could still stand with ease. It contradicts nothing. But there is a few extra details that are worth adding around this era as well, because as the novels were coming out, Bugman became more and more famous. As the roleplay game discussed anything to do with beer, they always said, Bugman's 6X! Bugman's 6X in particular, because that's the one that was most commonly referred to, although there's other ones. King's Gold is one of Big Bugman's brews, as is Troll Brew, Dark Choice. There's when the Rangers were reformed, we got ourselves the rather impressively named Bugman's Castle 9X, because, hey, 6X isn't good enough. So 9X, yeah, there's lots of different brews. All that really matters is that Josef Bugman, come this era, starts having extra details added to his past, in particular who his family were. And those details are really loose, and they're very much, when Ekrund fell, long time ago, some 4,000 years ago or whatever it is, the family of Bugmans moved out from there, moved over to the Dragonback Mountains, lived there for a while, moved into the Black Mountains, lived there for a while, moved into the Grey Mountains, lived there for a while, and then eventually moved down into the Empire where they formed their brewery. And there's Bugman clan members potentially throughout the mountains over there. There's also one other little hinter dropped down, and I think Gav added in one of his novels, where he mentions that Carrick Norn may have indeed been founded by the Bugmans as well, which is a nice little detail, giving perhaps some hoary connection to that particular hold. Although if that were the case, I think Bugman very likely would have gone to Carrick Norn rather than Barak Var.
Yeah, I think for that part he was doing a fun little reference to, so in 6th edition Bugman only got a paragraph, but in the army painting section, they did Bugman's Rangers in the Carrick Norn section. They were like, they're near it, so you could paint them in Carrick Norn colors. So they were a Carrick Norn themed unit. So I imagine that was an allusion to that.
Yeah, that makes sense. I love that. And nice call out there from Gav. And then that's it, but not quite. As I'm sure Sotek will probably point out some bits I missed because I'm running this from memory. We have the end times.
It's very impressive.
We have the end times. And then when we move to the end times, Bugman is sort of mentioned there again. He comes along and goes, don't worry, Thorgrim. As long as there's, halls, the dwarves will be about. It'll be fine. I'll carry. And then they all die. So he might not have died because, Games Workshop and Bugman, and he has sworn an oath. And it is worth noting that when you swear an oath as a dwarf, funny things happen. But we might get on to that as we go on.
We'll talk about some funny things that do happen in Age of Sigmar regarding Josef Bugman. But,
yeah, quite. So that all being said, what we have with Josef Bugman is a character that started off all the way back in 1984 with the Regiments of Renown. And the story of a brewer whose brewery was destroyed. Now he hates goblins. He forms himself Rangers, and they're goblin killers. And that story never changes. The details, the specifics change, but the general story remains the same to the end. There's only one thing that doesn't quite make sense in the whole lot of it, and that's that Bugman's brew continues to be made underneath the guidance to a degree of master, ridiculous brewer that is Josef Bugman, but equally, he's a mysterious figure that wanders around with his Rangers. So there's a small hole in the story there that needs some consolidation, because Bugman 6X is everywhere. But that can be very easily fixed if we just go all the way back to 2nd edition and take that story and repurpose it and ping it back in. So there's my intro. Josef, the master brewer. I love him dearly, and the reason why I love him dearly is because the very first Regiment of Renown that I bought was Josef Bugman's Rangers. I painted the first Josef all the way back when I was almost in single digits in terms of my lifespan.
Yeah, back when to get your paints, you had to go carve it out of the clay yourself.
yeah, totally. And mix it up with the oils and then poison yourself with the lead. So it was a lead miniature, in fact. And I painted them terribly. They had proper eggs for eyes really, really badly. And I painted them with enamel paints as well to tell you how old it was. Not great. And I attempted to play with them, but my knowledge of Warhammer at that point was entirely, let's say, lore-based, not game-based. And I think it was the second edition of the game I was playing it with. Oh my God, I didn't understand the game back then because I was just a tiny, tiny kid. But I did love painting the miniatures, and I did indeed paint them. And when the newer version of that model came out, I bought that and the next one and the next one. There have been so many Josef Bugman miniatures now, including for Blood Bowl. So he's a character who gets around. And with that, what's next?
So we have a lot of really, really cool things to discuss.
A drink of wine, which is almost beer.
Close enough. Yeah. Yeah, the two, nothing like the hosts that are like, beer? Nah, couldn't be me, but...
No. We are the worst Lorebeards ever. We don't drink beer.
We're responsible. Yeah, that's how we'll swing it. All right, so we have a lot of little super chat stuff to get caught up on, and then we're going to dive into kind of where his story kind of ends up at the end. So kind of talking about like the most recent version of the tale, as well as a couple other things. Then we're going to get into the implications of the story. Because I've already seen a number of super chats that are asking some questions that are going to get answered by what we're going to talk about today. Because Bugman's story is one of those things that in typical Lorebeards fashion, we could just take it at face value and talk for 30 minutes and then be done. Or we could do what we always do and talk about what it actually really could and should mean. And we'll be here for another 2.5 hours. So let's get into it with, okay, we already did that one. Brendan Liu, Bugman is here. Played Dark Deeds with friends and read the Skarsnik novel over the holidays. Such a good read. Would Bugman ever consider drinking greenskin fungus brew? I really doubt it.
No.
That would be, that'd literally be like going to you and being like, would you drink this pile of disgusting slop that I pulled off the side of this tree? It's delicious. And you'd probably say, no, I don't wish to die. No, thank you.
And yes, if anyone's going to bring up Dark Deeds, I will indeed mention Dark Deeds and say you should go buy yourself a copy yourself, made by Warhammer Legends. Andy Chambers and Mark Gibbons, and of course, myself involved as well. Dark Deeds, available now from diffuse.co.uk.
If you watched that recent reveal and saw that sexy new High Elf model and went, wow, that's a beautiful model. That's Mark Gibbons. You can own a game that he did the art for. It's great.
Absolutely. Not only that, if you're a follower of Trench Crusade, because I'm sure there's some of you out there that are, both Mark Gibbons and Andy Chambers have just been pulled on to help with that too. So if you like Trench Crusade, you should buy Dark Deeds.
Oh man, that's gonna be some gorgeous art then. Corin Shima, woohoo! How does a dwarf feel about fine wine? So it depends on
Depends on who's writing it.
Yeah, it depends on who's right. A lot of writers will go kind of the stereotype joke where they'll drink it and be like, oh, well, this tastes like piss and it's very elfish and this is garbage and I hate it. There are some that tend to take a more, let's say, nuanced approach where dwarves tend to have a really, really strong sense of taste, not quite as intense as halflings, but they're very appreciative of a lot of like really intense flavors. They tend to go for really strong stuff. So if you're dealing with human wine, like Bretonnian wine or Empire wine stuff, they're probably not going to say anything super nice. But if you're dealing with like some of the wilder elven wines, like what you might get from Ulthuan or Athalorn and stuff, they would have an appreciation for it pretty much until the fact that it's elf made probably comes up, and then they're going to immediately like pivot to grumbling for unrelated reasons. But dwarves have a very specific palate, which often requires like very strong things.
Yeah, in fact, I'll go further than that. Dwarf beer has been taken beyond standard beer. Dwarf beer is, if I was going to use a single word, and it might be a word that you don't expect, nourishing. Dwarf beer, in fact, is so nourishing that many dwarves have been renowned for living on dwarf beer alone, not eating any food, for weeks on end. Dwarf beer is different to other alcohols. Now, dwarves, particularly Bugman, who is selling to humans, create different types of beer. They create beer that are designed to be drunk by humans. They also create beer that's designed to be drunk by dwarfs, and they require something and want something that's much deeper, not just in terms of flavor, but in terms of what it can do. And it is, bluntly, nourishing. Wine makes you drunk and little more, and also tastes a little bit like sour grapes. And as we all know, dwarves normally love sour grapes. They love just whining about everything, don't they? But when it comes to wine in particular, because it hasn't got that nourishing aspect to it, it is thin. It is weak, it is watery, and at best will make them a little bit lightheaded. So it doesn't carry the same cultural, let's say, weight, nor does it carry the same just simply nourishing weight. It is a very simple liquid. So whilst the finer details of a really nice elven wine were very appreciated in Dwarven history, and there's many examples of the elves arriving with spectacular, sparkling or magically infused elven wines that they gave to the kings of old, and they were like, holy shitballs, well, this is different to anything we've had. Compare that though to the watery crap that's produced in, say, Tilia or the Empire, and they're like, yeah, well, nah. So loosely speaking, how do they feel about a fine wine? What's the point? I can't eat this and live in it, can I? This is weak stuff. So you tend to find that many of them have a pretty poor opinion. But any of the dwarves that actually live in the Empire or live in Bretonia or wherever they might be expatriated to, expatriates, pardon me, they often get tastes for the local stuff, particularly because wines and bottled wines are often safer than some of the water sources. So that's what they'll be drinking. So be aware, it's nuanced, but most writers will just go, ha, elven bullshit, ah, rubbish, no, algae, because writers love lapsing into stereotype.
Yep. Which, as a fun aside, actually, to reinforce what Andy just said, if you're ever playing Wolf Rep and your characters encounter like actual dwarf made for dwarf beers, one of the fun things to deal with that is it doesn't just make you, like, it will make you drunk. Don't get me wrong. Very, 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 very quickly. But the other thing is it's like eating a full meal. So like think about when you overeat and the unpleasantness that comes with that because your body's like struggling to digest. And dwarf beer can really easily do that to you if your body's not made for it.
Yeah, totally.
When you're thinking about what happens when I fail my endurance or consume alcohol checks, that's what happens.
Yeah, and they thin it down for humanity, which is why some, say for example, the special brew, the Bugman special brew is specifically designed for humans, and several human emperors have been on the receiving end of that particular brew.
Farseer Aerodrell, for thousands of years I've been dormant. Who was to serve my... Oh, the Bugman's live is here.
Yay! Yeah, we got there eventually.
Biofoot, wait, Andy, you brought us too far back, and now I can afford a, house. There's also somebody telling me to build a stone pyramid. Yes. Hey, for affordable housing is around. What a kind gentleman he is. Holy Artist, this is the Tawi stream. No algae drops allowed. Take a whiskey then, Andy.
I don't know if I've got some over in the corner, but it is much to the dismay of my Scottish pals, bourbon, because anyone that knows me knows that I drink Jack Daniels, bourbon in general. I am a heretic as far as most Scottish people are concerned. Happy to be so.
Donovan, Josef Bugman's dad was trying to find the perfect beer, but he still hasn't found what he's looking for. I feel like there's a joke in here relating to him being named off Bono.
Oh, wait a minute. He still hasn't found what he's looking for. Bono. U2. It's a U2 quotation.
There you go.
There you go. And yes, he was, because Joseph's original dad was named Bono, which to this day still makes me laugh.
It's probably for the best they got rid of that, but it is very funny to me. They just axed a generation.
What I quite liked was when you moved into 4th edition, they took the name Samuel and they turned it to Zamnil. And I really quite liked that, because they looked at the old Samuel name and they were like, yeah, no, we can't use that for a dwarf name. So we'll call it Zamnil. And then he changes it to Samuel so he fits in with the Empire. Quite like that. They could have done the same with Bono.
I like they looked at it and went, no, there's no salvaging it, just axe. Just get rid of it. Holy Artist, Sotek isn't the brewery of building Carrick Zorn. Yes, and it drives me crazy that it's way over there because it shouldn't be.
It's in Carrick Zorn in Total War.
Yeah, so it's over by the Blackwater, which no, it's not in Carrick Zorn. It's not in Carrick Zorn. It's in I can't remember the name of the settle. Agro Migdal, I think. No, because it's over in Barak Var's province. So it's on the wrong side of. So
Barak Var is not awful. If it's down by Barak Var, because that's where it said it would be all the way back in 2nd edition.
Yeah, it's moderately close to Barak Var, I guess.
Yeah.
No, I can also see the confusion when I was reading one of the, I think it was the 7th or 8th edition book, and they say, the author says, oh yeah, Josef Bugman set up in the foothills of the Grey Mountains in the eastern forest of the Empire. And I was like, I don't think this author knows his east from his west.
Yeah.
Because that's on the other side. So it could be that someone from whoever did that for Total War like read it and was like, oh, eastern side of the Empire, I'll put it over there.
Yeah, so, that wouldn't surprise me.
You never know with those things. Psych, this is just Willy Wonka, but in Warhammer with beer instead of chocolate. Yeah, you're not entirely wrong.
Yep. Josef Bugman. Oompa Loompa. Yeah, absolutely.
Mornington Crescent, does this mean the first known grudge and thus the whole fight between dwarves and greenskins was you spilled my pint back in the older editions? Probably.
Yeah, probably.
I mean, that would...
I was just going to say, it's always quite fun going back to the older editions because you can see all of the seeds of what's to come mixed in with stuff that just doesn't work anymore by any stretch of the imagination. For example, having Josef Bugman selling his beer to goblins and going over to local goblin tribes and selling it to them because he doesn't care about who's buying it. All he cares about is the coin that he gets in return.
Yep. Here we've got from Nightentool. It would be a complete and utter atrocity if Bugman is our free lord in Total War by the end of the life cycle. I don't know if it'll be free, but I do think we will get him at some point. I would definitely say he's lurking somewhere in the shadows waiting to come to the game. It would not surprise me if he ended up being a White Dwarf free character. They have done that for each one of the games except for this one. But we'll have to see what happens. Darius Rose, how potent is dwarf ale for a human? How many drinks before I'm shit-faced or dead? It depends.
It depends what you're drinking. There's multiple different types of dwarf ale. It's a little bit like saying, I'll give a completely different analogy, but how potent is alcohol for a human? How many drinks before I'm shit-faced or dead? Depends entirely on what you're drinking alcohol-wise. And many of the dwarf-only dwarven brews are not necessarily as strong as you'd expect, but they're very difficult to drink. They're thick and they're syrupy. And as already discussed, they're like an entire meal. And dwarf stomachs are a good bit bigger than humans. You just can't stomach the stuff. By comparison, other beers are very, very, very strong. And dwarves are equally going to get very inebriated by this. Remember, all of the stories with our dwarves have them drinking in human taverns, drinking human beer, and getting drunk. So don't in many respects, turn this into some sort of fetishization of dwarfs and just how amazingly strong their constitutions are and how they're so much better than everyone else. They are, but beyond that, they are also not that ridiculous. So how potent is it? Depends on the brew itself, but some of them are horrendous. You're not even going to get through one before you're shit-faced. But you're probably not going to get through one because it's just too filling.
Yep. Sintermeister, as another beer hater, what's Warhammer Fantasy's best cider?
Cider. There's all manner of ciders mentioned throughout. Most of them are like smaller sides in a novel or a little bit in a roleplay game, and they don't really focus on any of them with any strong, this is the best one. There's a few mentions down in the Mootland, for example, of, I can't remember, it's the Sour Apple cider, I can't remember its name, as being described as one of the best ones from down in the Mootland, which comes from the Green Hills, as I recall. But long story short, cider is not a stress for most of the writers, so thus it's never really been given the central position that it rightly deserves.
Yeah, Cubicle 7, give us our damn trappings book with all the different drink types, please.
That would be awesome.
What does Bugman's best actually taste like? Oh, good luck with that.
Bugman's best bitter probably tastes like a very thick, heavy, dark ale with a lot of sedimentation that is hopefully left when the beer itself settles. You're probably looking at a very dark stout if you're looking for a real version of it.
Holy Artist. So Josef Bugman is Story Whitebeard. No, but yes.
Yes, I'd agree with that.
We'll talk about this more as we kind of get into.
We're going to get onto that one, all right.
Yeah, I suspect this is more of a joke question, but as the editions got later, Gromerdal went from being like an actual character that you could take within like certain games and stuff to being more of like a collector piece, and he essentially got replaced in the actual like rules with Bugman, which resulted in Bugman evolving from being a dwarf with an interesting story to being beyond. So we'll get to that. Andres, how does Olgu inspire wanderlust? Totally on topic.
Totally on topic.
I suppose Bugman did wander after his brewery was destroyed.
Okay, so this one's super easy because it does. And I know that that is not particularly satisfying, but each of the winds of magic have got, let's say, flavors. Each of the winds of magic have got ways of expressing and things that they elicit in others. Bright wind, the red wind, elicits anger and it inspires anger in other people, and rage. If we move over to, say, the gold wind, it does the same, but greed this time. And it can make people very analytical and greedy, and I must have this. Olgu inspires not just the urge to wander, but the urge to experience, because one of the great qualities of those who have mastered the Grey Wind is also their wisdom. They have seen a wider world and they know more of it. So broadly speaking, it's because that's the way the wind is. It's a rubbish answer, but it's basically true.
I understand why Bugman went out to get revenge. This is a great question. But why did he never just build a new brewery and continue the work of his ancestors? Maybe he could have schooled some new brewers with an expertise in greenskin slaying. We will get to this. This is probably going to be like the biggest thing in today's stream. So hang on just a little bit. We will get to this because it has to do with oaths.
Oaths. And yeah, I agree. But I would also say that much like Slayers, before we get on to all of this, and we're going to dive into this one deep because I think it needs it. But much like Slayers are 100% Slayers, some of them do other things. Now, can Josef have done parts of this? The answer is yes, and I would suggest it's definitely the case. Even Total War apparently has a nice little brewery sitting out there doing its thing. It's definitely out there somewhere, but I think there is a big problem that sits in the way of him doing it directly, and that indeed is his oath.
The other thing I'll say is that, and granted, this isn't necessarily consistent, but there's been some notes among writers that the master brewers of the dwarfs are not entirely dissimilar from the Rune Lords, in that they can sometimes be pretty bad about very jealously guarding their knowledge, in the sense that they don't want to pass it on to someone they don't think is worthy of it. But because dwarfs can have exceedingly high standards, this can result in issues where a master brewer or a rune lord will die before they pass it on because they never were able to find someone they consider worthy of the knowledge. Now, brewers seem to have a bit of a better reputation for passing it on to their descendants within their clan. And that's likely because the family ties of breweries are a lot more like direct descendants, whereas rune lords, it's a little bit more messy. But that being said, you could say there's something of that as well. Is people trying to find Bugman and be like, I want to learn from you, and Bugman being like, you're not good enough. How could I possibly teach you my family secret when you're not good enough? That happens a lot with dwarves, and it's a tragedy.
I agreed in all of that, but it is worth noting, as I said right at the beginning in the introduction, that at least in one version of the background, the brewery is re-established down in Barak Var. And he does not personally deal with it because he's got his own business to deal with.
And in Total War, it's in Kadag Dromar, which I don't hate as like where he rebuilt it. It's kind of a fun place to be.
It's as good as any, I suppose. And he rebuilt, and it's not him that rebuilds it in that version. It's the king that he goes to, because he basically goes, I want to go and kick more greenskin butt, and I've run out. And he reforms the Rangers with the king's support. And in return, he provides everything required for the master brewery. So they basically do a trade. And then he fucks off with a new set of dwarf Rangers and terrorizes greenskins from that point onwards.
Yep. Siegfried, if Bugman chose Total War, what type of character should he be? A duelist or a more buff-centric character? I would say you'd probably want him to be a reasonably buff-heavy ranged melee hybrid character. So he's not like the best ranged character, but he's got his crossbow, and he's not the best melee character, but he's got a kick-ass axe, and he's reasonably tanky. But he should mainly be a heavy support character. Of that, he's got his Tankard, which we'll talk about, which is one of the most over-the-top, insane healing items in the setting. And he's also, it's fucking Bugman. Dwarves would fight to the... Bugman has become such a legend as he evolved throughout the editions that he's now kind of up there with, like, dwarves would be laying down their lives to make sure that Bugman lives another day.
Yeah, it's true. I mean, where originally Bugman was nothing more than a vengeance-driven dwarf who was seen by many as a wasted piece of opportunity because he was such a good brewer, but instead he's wasting his life moving around the Darklands killing greenskins. And that's all he's doing. What an absolute waste. That has turned into him being effectively almost like the White Dwarf, who turns up at battles, takes on the greenskins, is greatly celebrated and loved by all the dwarfs for his great masterworks when it comes to brewing. He is widely celebrated in a way that in previous editions he just wasn't at all in the slightest. He has moved from being almost a mid-tier dwarf to top-tier dwarf through the course of the editions.
He's invested his experience wisely over the course of his campaign. Benara, did Bugman ever catch his goblin oath fulfilled? I think in the older stuff, no. I don't think he ever got Git Guzzler.
Never. In fact, Git Guzzler is that big open goal that I'm pretty sure was never resolved. And Git Guzzler managed to do something that I think dwarfs across the old world would be incredibly keen to see him killed for. But having said that, though, the fact that in the original tale he goes back to his brewery in some respects suggests that he went over to the Darklands and killed that goblin. But that's before he was even called Git Guzzler. It's also worth noting that even in the initial editions, he doesn't just go out and try to find all the goblins that were responsible. Once he's killed those, he keeps going. And keeps going and keeps going. And that's before we get the modern version where he is scaled up to 11. And then they've gone, I'm pretty sure that my dial goes past 11 because I'm playing Warhammer and I can easily get to 100. And they properly dial him up even further. But I think the answer is, if you go with all versions of the background, the answer is yes. But if you go with the current version of the background, the answer is probably no.
Yeah, and they never stated explicit. And granted, as we got into the later editions, Git Guzzler, they just kind of stopped talking about him. He just sort of like falls out. I was really pleased to see him show up in Total War, though he shows up as an antagonist to Grom, which is very funny. So we'll talk about that in a bit. Jonathan Scott, so what are the rules of today's drinking game?
Wine.
Responsible, but I don't know, every time we say oath, try not to die. Dino Man, whenever the type of beer is brought up, it's always dwarf ale. Do you think dwarves also brew lager, or is ale a long-standing tradition? Any dwarf that attempts to make lager would be seen as radical, like an overly inventive engineer.
Damn those overly inventive engineers. One of the reasons is because ale sounds old, and you know how much a writer loves something that sounds more fantasy, don't you? Where lager sounds like something you'll order down your local pub. So you tend to find that no matter the provenance of various types of drinks, writers have got their preferences because they think of one thing as being oldie and the other one as being moderny, and they try not to mix them up. So that being the case, the true answer is there'll be all manner of different drinks. Loads of them.
My favorite is when fantasy writers are like, well, I don't want to use kilometer because that sounds too sciencey, and I don't want to use mile because that sounds too modern, so let's use leagues. That'll work. And you go, why?
It's just 3 miles, dude. It's just 3 miles. That's all a league is defined as, you idiot. God
but
damn
it's like I shouldn't have to look these things up. Just use a word I'll understand. Dino Man, whoops, meant to post this in super. So dwarf beer is more like ancient Egyptian / Mesopotamian beer, and that it's basically liquid bread, with the main difference that dwarf beer can be much higher in alcohol content as well. It's that and
Kinda.
more.
Yeah, that and more, I agree.
Because it's not just that it fills you up, it's genuinely nutritional.
Yeah.
Which is crazy. But dwarfs. They learned it from Valea, a literal god. So the great ancestor goddess herself. Charles C.K. If dwarf beer is nourishing, doesn't that mean it's immediately? Yep. We just talked about that. Yep. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. I think just so you get an idea in general here, it isn't consistent. Some beers are exactly like our beers. Some of their alcohols are just like ours. Others are far thicker, far more syrupy. What you can say for certain is that all of their various outputs are of top quality from a dwarf perspective. So if, for example, in your world, you think dwarves love it to be smooth and creamy and slip down your throat, then no, it won't be oaty, it won't be mealy, it won't be grainy. What it'll be is very smooth, very carefully crafted. Because if you want to have your own artisanal crafty beer, the dwarves are where you go. And they do it really, really well, using skills that have been handed down for generation after generation over thousands of years, and fine crafted. So whatever it is as its manifestation, it is peak.
Yeah, they're perfectionists.
Because they are, all of them, perfectionists. They're the sort that will sit up all night just making sure that it's got exactly the right head, exactly the right flavor, exactly the right taste. But you got to remember, the vast majority of their ales and their drinks that they're drinking are your sloshy kind. It's just that their beers can also be quite different, and they are prized for it.
Exposure, glad to have you guys back. We're excited to be back.
Indeed, it's nice.
Warzag's Borky Mischief. Do the Dwarven of AOS have an equivalent of Bugmans? Yes, they do. I'm currently making my way through Go Trek AOS book series, and he makes it plain many times he does not care for the Air of the Mortal Realm. So there, if you pick up and read the, so I was going to talk about this a little later, but I'll just knock it out now because it's very short. Sure. In the Grombrindal series, which has a book now, which is the Tales of the Wanderer, I think. One of the short stories in it is about the direct descendants of Josef Bugman. And Grombrindal, they don't really know that. Who knows? But somehow he managed to keep his line going through the apocalypse and the literal planet blowing up. But well done. So
that's fun, because that tells us something that is worth noting, and that's that he has a kid.
Yeah. So what is genuinely interesting,
isn't the case in any Warhammer lore I'm aware of.
Yeah, so the big storyline that's fun is that, so you meet a very direct descendant of his, distant descendant, and they talk about how his axe, all trustworthy, is literally hanging on the wall. And Grombrindal, yeah, like his axe is there because it's been passed down. And they're like, we don't know what it does. No one's wielded it in generations, but it's there. And you have Grombrindal's been carrying around his stein, but the whole story is about Grombrindal visits this tavern of Bugman's descendants once every couple decades, and he always gets one drink, and he always drinks it out of Bugman's stein. And the whole story is you get a passing of the torch from the father to a daughter, and this so you get Bugman's great something infinite times granddaughter, and the story is mostly about her growing up, seeing Grombrindal multiple times, and then she takes over the tavern just in time for it to get destroyed by the undead. But as it's destroyed, she finally picks up the axe, starts to wield it, and Grombrindal goes, okay, you're ready. I've been holding on to this for your family, but it's yours now. And he gives her Bugman's
Tankard.
stein.
Oh, trust
and he's
me.
like, it's your time now. And she goes, okay. And she leads a bunch of survivors out, and they escape Nagash's hordes and go somewhere. It's a really, really fun story. It's a very good story. And it also ends with an argument between Grombrindal and Nagash that is super fun. About the Dwarven afterlife and how Nagash can't get to it. And it's the only underworld he cannot get to canonically in the setting, which is awesome. Because the dwarves hid it from him and he can't find it. It makes him really butthurt. But all that to say, Bugman has descendants. Even they released a special model for the Caradron Overlords, which is a Bugman model. He's not Josef Bugman, though, but he is a direct descendant of Bugman. I forget what his first name is. And he's a Caradron Overlord that's got a big stein. He's really fun. But his true inheritor is a Rin, or a dwarf female that's running around somewhere in the realm of Shaman, I think, or actually one of those two in the modern timeline. So there's somebody out there, but it's a woman now, which is cool.
So I just, because I can't not bring this up, and how At the best estimate, how long after the destruction of the Warhammer world and the absolute obliteration of the planet is Age of Sigmar?
My genuine, honest to God thought, based on all the reading I've done, is I think it is at minimum hundreds of thousands of years later, probably
Then
millions of years
that
later.
story makes no sense at all.
It is a bonkers mess. But that's a story for another time. That's a story for another time.
I just wanted to make sure that I wasn't getting it wrong. So I was thinking maybe if it was like, say for example, 30k in Warhammer, Warhammer 30k to Warhammer 40k, 10,000 years for dwarves, that could be a legitimately acceptable number of generations. And if you can come up with some fashion of how they survived, I'm sure that would make sense. But if it's, say, 10 times that at 100,000 years, if it's more than that, that makes little to no sense.
Because I will say the funniest thing about it, and I will always applaud and I will both applaud and laugh at Games Workshop at the same time, is the way that they handled the how do we get all the races that we all know and love, despite the fact the planet blew up full on. Like, it wasn't like it blew apart like fucking what's his face did in 40k, the planet that broke before the guard did or whatever, where like chunks of it kind of blew up, but it's still Cadia. We're like, there's still chunks of Cadia. No, it's like dust in the wind level of blow up. Is that when the realms formed, which took a super long time, right? That was most of the gap, was the realms forming again, like stars. The lore literally says, yeah, so the realms formed and then the dwarfs just woke up. Like as far as Grimnir and Grugni were concerned, the end of the world happened. They fell asleep because they got knocked out and died, and then they go, whoa, and they're awake, and hey, look, I'm on a new planet somewhere because magic just brought me back, and there's a bunch of random dwarfs around me. Cool. That's literally as far. They're like, don't worry about it, we're moving on. It's their version of dealing with it, which is very funny to me.
Wow. Okay, fair enough. Good to know. Let's move on.
Yep. Laughing God, Bugman should have crossover with gnomes. I think there could be an interesting little tale there, but sure, why not? Andres Baranek, Olgu inspires curiosity, kinda. Does Hish inspire stagnation in a form of narcissism?
Actually, no. Hish is very much the wind of intellect and the wind of understanding. So stagnation wouldn't be quite correct in that because they are constantly bettering
I would say maybe
minds.
Obsession, but not stagnation.
Yeah, obsession's closer to Shimon though. Yeah, there's like a nice mixture of stuff going on there, but a form of narcissism. In fact, I would say in general, I would say rather than narcissism for Hish, I would generally go down more sociopathy and the erosion of emotion. So that you are left with basically psychopaths. That would make more sense for Hish.
Total Warrior, loving all the videos. Are there any plays to do a video on Dragonfels? Eventually, yes.
Eventually, because Dragonfels is great.
Yeah, and it would be fun to talk about what would be like a more modern understanding of a story, because Games Workshop never bothered to do that. He just showed up one day and was a very different character. Go watch our Ranking the Mortarch stream.
Nameless!
And then he died and vanished again.
Man.
Peter M., what is the closest competition to Bugman's Ale? They're like, most holds have their own master brewers. They don't tend to get a lot of details because most of the time writers will quite literally pick up the idea of like, oh, it's similar to whatever, or like, oh, it's good, but it's not Bugman 6X is a really common phrase in Warhammer lore. I cannot even tell you how many times I've seen that phrase pop up in a Black Library book or something of it's good, but it's not Bugman's. That's like a classic phrase.
Yeah, I would generally say that Bugman's and its dominance over the dwarf beer space within the writing means that every other master brewer just gets sidelined in a way that isn't the case in the Empire, because they never bothered saying that one was better than another. So if we look at the lore that's been created for the Empire, we have literally dozens of wines and beers that have been mentioned in the setting, ranging from everything from like Dark Maiden stout that is made in one monastery, or if we go to the ice type of wine that's made over in Callaghan or whatever it might be, there's all manner of different ones. Or the down at the Ranald's Delight. No, that's the drug, rattle something else that's made down near Ubersreich. There's loads of them because every time they go to a new place, they go, oh, I better include some sort of wine or beer. They don't bother looking to see what everyone else has created to make their own. But whenever it comes to dwarves, they always go, oh, I don't need to make one. I'll just use Bugman's. And it sucks.
Yeah, more variety would be nice because presumably there shouldn't be that much Bugman's left in the world, but it always shows up.
In some respects, I almost made a joke about that in the Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay starter set, where we actually had one of the brewers there be a bloody cousin of Bugman's, claiming to be a relative, but kind of wasn't. And yeah, that was fun.
Yep. Sean Schultz, how would Dalby Brew affect an elf? Probably not terribly dissimilar to how it would affect most people, unless it was a particularly notable brew, unless Andy has something to add there.
Yeah, I will. Elves are notorious for their unexpectedly capable constitutions because it's not that they have high constitutions, it's just their bodies work differently. So you tend to find that elven wines, for example, are often described as having this light, crisp taste, whatever else it might be. But if someone else drinks it, they get drunk really, really, really fast. And it's not because necessarily elves have got higher constitution than other species. It's just that elves don't get drunk in the same way. It takes a different set of compounds. That being the case, it's quite possible that an elf might drink a dwarf under the table. But equally, depending on the brew, they very well might not. It's something that's been very poorly described in the various books that we have because each writer has taken loosely their own view in it. Some have gone, elves are weak pansies, aren't they? So I'm going to have them collapse. Others have gone, nope, they absolutely aren't. They're just different. And they can drink wine all day and they'll never get drunk because of what they are. So the answer to this is it varies.
Yep. Okay, last two, and then we're going to get into some stuff. Random thought, but what happens if a dwarf has an oath of vengeance and someone else fulfills it? Does their reaction depend on the reason someone else killed it? For example, if a dwarf killed Get Guzzler for Bugman, would it be different than if a human had just killed him because it was a goblin?
Right, so first, your idea that an oath can be so easily fulfilled in such a fashion is interesting because if they didn't fulfill it, the oath is not fulfilled.
Yeah,
it's just not. It's not fulfilled. The oath is still outstanding. And indeed, if we look at Josef Bugman, and we're going to be covering this, I imagine, very soon, so I'm not going to go into any detail here. But if we look at Josef Bugman, he does not stop. Josef Bugman starts off by chasing down the goblins, and he then moves on to hobgoblins, orcs, greenskins in general, and never ever stops. So the answer to this might be actually Josef Bugman and what happened to him, which could be that Get Guzzler was possibly killed by someone else. His oath of vengeance can never be completed. He will fight until the end of his days.
Yeah, something to keep in mind about dwarves is that dwarves are really specific, and they are very, very ironclad to sticking to the print, the letter of an oath sworn. Mm-hmm. And that, from a human perspective, can get ridiculous, where a human would look at it and go, well, what you wanted to happen happened, so I don't understand why you're still upset. And the dwarf says, because I have not fulfilled the oath. I didn't do what I said I was going to do.
So they keep going. Yeah,
so totally. They'll just keep going. And if they're lucky, there are things in dwarf laws as far as oaths are concerned about like passing on to like next of kin or resolving through other matters. But sometimes you can run into a dead end situation. The dwarf's just kind of fucked. And they just keep going forever, hoping to maybe find some way to deal with it until they die.
And it's also worth noting as well that to the dwarf psyche, that's not necessarily a bad thing. There's several examples of dwarf oaths that have been sworn, and you tend to find that it becomes all-consuming for them. It's not that they think, oh shit, I'm stuck with this. They're focused on fulfilling their oath or driving on towards the next point. They're not worrying about whether it will be resolved or not. They're just going, and they're going, and they're going, and they're moving towards their next point of obsession. So yeah, in many respects, you could argue that the Goldwind drives much of the dwarf psyche, you could argue, even though, as we all know, they're kind of immune to it.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, there have been dwarves that have fulfilled an oath they've been chasing for a long time, and they genuinely are like, I don't know what to do now. Like a form of depression sets in because
absolutely.
That purpose is gone.
It's a little bit like people who have been serially at work their entire lives. That has become their life, and then they retire, and their entire life falls apart. They break up with their families. They go through weird midlife or late life crises. They don't know what to do with themselves because the obsession of their life turned out to be their work, which is ultimately meant to be there just for them to make money. But as it turns out, no, it's not. It has become what they go for. And dwarves have a psyche that make humans look relatively, flighty. And the most obsessive human looks flighty in comparison to a dwarf. Dwarves are obsessive by nature. So, yeah.
Holy Artist, what's Michael Jackson's favorite wind of magic? Shamon. Yeah.
Shamona!
Yeah, that is definitely a joke that has been made many times. So
I mean, I make it myself still.
Yeah. All right. So Josef Bugman. One of the things that's really, really interesting about him is there's through the course of Andy's story, one of the things you'll note is that, and we'll kind of dial on this specifically, is that there's a big jump between, so you get 5th edition Bugman, who was like the kind of the classic old situation of just kind of being like a cool dwarf. And then in 6th edition, he gets reduced down to a single paragraph in the whole book. He gets one paragraph that's very short in the Dwarfs of Legend little chapter where they would like mention a bunch of different special characters. Because interestingly, in that book,
I was getting my editions mixed up between 6th and 7th.
So what's interesting about that one is like 6th edition did that a lot, where you would get like 2 playable special characters, and then there would be a page that would mention the rest of them. So he's on there with like a High King Thorgrim Grudgebearer, who was not actually playable in 6th edition.
Crazy.
Because 6th edition focused on Alric Ranulfson, the king of Katakirn, because he was running around doing stuff, which was weird, but fine. He was a cool character. Beautiful artwork for him. But anyway, so then 7th edition comes around. And 7th edition looks at Bugman, because what 7th edition did compared to 6th is that 7th re-expanded the cast of characters. But Games Workshop decided, okay, all of these characters that we're going to mention need to be playable, they need to have rules, and they need to have minis. Now, we're not going to release all their minis right away, but they all need to have like custom artwork and custom miniatures, and we want as many of them as possible. Which was similar to what they had done in the past, but because of the 6th edition break, there was kind of this build-up, and then when 7th again, it went out. So Bugman goes from being just a dwarf to being the dwarf.
Yeah.
And gets all of the special rules added. And in order to make him feel particularly special, they give him some pretty batshit crazy magic items. Most notably his Stein. And the thing about his Stein is it's the most important thing to understand about what makes Bugman go from being a dwarf to the dwarf. In that the ancestral Bugman's Tankard, which has been passed down since the days of Ekrond and before. So it's this ancient beat up metal Stein that the Bugmans have had for as long as anyone can remember. So back when they lived in the Dragonback Mountains, back at the mines of Ekrond, which was like 1500 or something years before the Empire was even founded, and then they get pushed out by the Greenskins. So they push out for the Greenskins. The Bugman clan, along with the rest of the Dragonback clans, flees north into the into kind of around the Kalazankor, but a lot of those dwarves decide to keep going into the Grey Mountains and the Black Mountains to found new holds rather than stay behind in the World's Edge Mountains, which causes a bit of an interesting schism around the dwarfs, but it's not something we're here to talk about today. Now, from here, like Andy said, the Bugman clan kind of wanders around, appearing in different holds and kind of helping establish your Karak Hirns, your Karak Norns, your Karak Asgaraz, and all those other places. And eventually, his father, Samuel, who becomes Samuel, sets up down in the foothills on the River Sol, up above like modern, or what was Sudenland. At the time it's mentioned.
It's South Mizenland.
Yeah. So, all that to say, this tankard has been traveling around this entire time. And the thing about this magical tankard is that it's genuinely magical. It doesn't have any obvious runes on it, but it has this really special ability, which is that so long as someone needs to drink from it, it's always full. Like, if it's handed to you, it'll magically be full, even though you won't see Bugman pull out a drink from anywhere. You'll drink from it, and when you're done drinking, it'll magically be empty. And it is one of the most powerful artifacts I have ever seen in the setting, which is because it only gets more powerful each edition. Where in 7th edition, it was like, oh yeah, this is a reasonably nice tankard that it's a unique, fairly heirloom that has this, and it talks about how there's this legend that when you drink from it, it doesn't just nourish your body, it nourishes your soul. When a dwarf drinks from it, it reminds them of the like glories of the past, bringing forth memories that they didn't even realize they had forgotten. And they feel refreshed and restored. But just to show how ridiculous the evolution is, in 7th edition, this lets you heal a single wound, and you also were like immune to fear and terror for like the rest of the battle or something. In 8th edition, this thing goes nuts, and the Bugman's Tankard jumps up to being a you can drink from this thing at the start of every turn. So any character can drink every turn from this thing, and it heals D3 wounds, which in tabletop terms for healing, that is a fuck ton of healing for a character. And you can do it every turn. This thing is nuts. And in the end times, it reaches its rather hilarious zenith, which is that, once again, putting into perspective how powerful this thing is, then I'm going to talk a little bit about it more specifically, is that the Bugman's Tankard is so strong that Thorgrim Grudgebearer gets dealt a terrible, terrible wound by a Vermin Lord. Vermin Lord Warbringer strikes him with a Doomglaive, and it manages to pierce his armor, hits him in the chest, and he's basically been struck by the warp-infused uber weapon of a demon that is the very embodiment of ruin. So he's dying, and he's just too stubborn to admit it. But he's undeniably dying. And the wound won't heal. Nobody can heal it. It's literally just eating him alive, rotting him away from the inside out. So at the end of the great battle against the Skaven, where Bugman shows up at the nick of time, which is he does a lot, which we'll talk about a little bit when we talk about his more mundane powers that I actually really, really like about the character. Bugman's like, here, Thorgrim, take a drink from this tankard. And Bugman kind of gives like some advice that makes him come off very Grombrindal-ish. Like he knows more than he's letting on. He knows like secrets that are kind of beyond mortal dwarfs. And when Thorgrim drinks from it, his wound heals. So this tankard heals one of the most impossible to heal things in the setting. And of course, the end times weirdness of it is like, Thorgrim's going to live. And then he immediately gets killed by Deathmaster Snitch, stabbing him in the back. But that tankard is, I would go so far as to say, is basically a goddamn like relic of Valea herself, because it's that level of stupid powerful. I don't know what it is. It doesn't have
sure
roots
it goes
on
that far. I mean,
it's bonkers.
I mean, it's
bonkers.
It's pretty decent, but you know, there's lots of crazy stuff like that in Warhammer, really. And it's worth noting that the tankard's been there almost from the beginning as well, because it's not a new artifact. I mean, it's detailed in, for example, the 4th edition as well.
Oh, okay, cool.
Bugman's Tankard is a 50-point item that allows you can use it, I think, 3 times in the battle, giving yourself wounds back as well. So it's been doing the same thing pretty much since the beginning, as I recall.
So it just got stronger for 8.
Yeah, it just gets as you work your way through the editions, as is often the case, they boost things a little. That was, I think, given to them rather than handed down year by year by year from the original description. I was just trying to see if I could find the write-up for it. I couldn't, which is really bugging me. I know it's somewhere. I think it's inside the magic items inside the Dwarf Army list, but I don't have that here. I was just checking through all the stuff that I had available here, and I don't have the Dwarf Army list. So that's the 4th edition Dwarf Army list. If anyone has it out there, do please go check up the artifacts. It's a 50-point artifact sitting on a page somewhere in the middle. And if you could drop inside the comments there, that'd be amazing, because it's bugging me right now. now. But yeah, it was there then. I don't think it was in an earlier edition. I will go check to see if it was in second or first, but I'm pretty sure it's not. But yeah, it's pretty bonkers in that it just heals. And the question is, who's most likely to have created that? Probably Valia, given the normal way that they create such things.
Yeah, I will say the thing that strikes me as interesting is it's one of the only dwarf items I know of that feels much more like a magic item, not a runic item.
Rather than a runic item. That's because it was created in a previous era. Before the deep runic nature of everything that was involved with the dwarfs was laid down. So I would, if we were repurposing it, for example, I would probably ground it into one of the holds that was founded by Valia. And have it be passed on to the brewing clan there, then passed down towards the Bugmans that way, because that would make sense. And would very much respond to the fact that it is a pretty impressive artifact.
Yeah, but now I want to get into the thing that I really want to talk about today, which is Bugman himself and kind of what his story represents. So yeah, so one of the things that we talked about in a little super chat earlier that came up that is worth really diving into is that someone asked, like, why didn't Bugman just kill a bunch of goblins, maybe get Guzzler, and then go back to what he's good at, go back to what he's genuinely passionate about, which is making brews, because that was his life's work. Yep. The modern stories talk about that while his father created and built the brewery, Josef Bugman is the one that really took it to the next level. Like Josef Bugman is the one who built up his own legacy of being the greatest brewer of all time. Despite his relative youth, because kind of like Andy said earlier, it'd be probably pretty generous to say he's anywhere beyond like maybe 130, 140-ish.
Yeah, I mean, he's literally given an age of 105 inside one book, although it's worth noting that Alfred literally looked at it all and went, I've got to make an age up. Let's go with 105. That makes him sort of old. That'll do.
It seems to fit, though.
But it fits relatively well. That would give him, say, for example, come 2022-ish, he'd be about 115, which means come the end of blowing up the world, which happens about just before 10 years after that.
25, 22, yeah.
Yeah. Okay, at 25, 22 is not when it blows up, though. I think it blows up a bit after that.
You said 22, 22.
Did I? I meant 25, yes. 22, sorry. That was a weird one. Thanks for catching me in that one. Yeah, so 25, 22. So he probably ends up being about 125-ish, a little bit before that come the blowing up of the world as a whole. That seems fine, although given the descriptions you get in some places, you really do get the idea that he should be a proper Langtromi. He should be an old dwarf with a long beard who has been fighting his war of vengeance, not just for decades, but maybe for a century or two. So there's parts of his story that feels like it should be far older, but it can't be, because we have a very clean story with Grom the Paunch being the inspiring point for the goblin that's looking to wipe out his brewery. That being the case, though, given he's a master brewer by that point already, he could already be 100, 120 by that point. There is no reason that he couldn't be 220, 250 come the end times. I do feel that there is probably space there, given especially that the only place that we have his age is in one source, and that was Alfred just pinning something down because he had to for the character. I would be quite happy if I was, for example, redoing the character today, go, yeah, no, that's not his age. That's maybe his age when he was, for example, taking his oath.
Mm-hmm. So, one of the things that we should probably dial down to really get into, here we go.
Thanks very much for that one.
I am pulling it up here. Oh my god, that text is really, really tiny. Let's see. The dwarf master brewer Bugman attained this tankard when he traveled widely, selling his ale to kings. Tankard is a typically dwarf form, but imbues its contents with astounding properties of recuperation, as well as bringing out the fine qualities of the brew inside. That's interesting. So according to this, he picked it up while he was traveling.
Yeah, totally.
Yep, 3 times per battle, and you can heal 1 wound.
Yeah.
But it can only be used once per turn. Oh, interesting. Okay.
Your opponent's wounds may not be increased beyond the drinker's normal level. That's actually a bit crap, because given how many wounds most of the dwarf characters have, because they're not wizards, they're sitting at like 2 normally, which means that you're only going to have 1 chance to use that, and that's if they lose 1 wound. Rubbish!
Yeah, okay, so here's an interesting thing. So there's a segment in the roleplay game for Age of Sigmar about Bugman. It says the name Bugman traces its origins back countless centuries beyond the age of myth to the ancient world that was, to a renowned brewer named Josef Bugman. Bugman's beers were famous across long forgotten land, prized by beer connoisseurs as the pinnacle of brewcraft. The Bugman's Brew Guild Company makes beer from Bugman's ancient recipes and sells them throughout the Caradron Skyport and some select human cities. None of these is more sought after than the famous 6X Ale. People have paid small fortunes for a keg of the beer, and a shocking amount of Dwarven have died just trying to get a look at the recipe. Today, Jacob Bugmanson, the 9th, Jacob Bugmanson the 11th, who is the brewmaster general, carries on the name and tradition of Josef Bugman. Jacob is a powerfully built Dwarven with a luscious gray beard and a single piercing blue eye. Speaks bluntly and tells people precisely what he thinks of them. If Jacob doesn't like you, you'll know about it. When he's relaxing with a pint of ale and good company, he's loud and raucous, often the first one to begin songs and call out for... So interesting. So they're the Bugmansons as opposed to the Bugmans.
That's an interesting choice. Sure.
Yeah. Anyway, so actually, you know what? I'm going to grab the missing super chest we haven't done yet, and then we're going to talk about the destruction of the tavern and how that genuinely affected Bugman without looking at it as kind of the joke it almost feels like from a distance. Sir Panza, dwarves would presumably distill drinks like whiskey and bourbon, but would they make other distilled drinks? Where in the Warhammer world can I have my tequila or mezcal equivalent?
Broadly, the dwarves are noted for their ale and beer et al. Brewing with a couple of others on top, and that's largely because of the ingredients that they have to hand. And they don't make your other tequila, mezcal, or indeed vodkas or anything else. Having said that, though, the dwarves do spread all the way through the mountains in a variety of places. So I'm sure you could make a couple of local variants if you wished, but ultimately they're much more interested in their beers and their brews. So where can you get those? In other places. Go to Estalia, Tilia, pop over to other parts of the world, go check your elves, but not the dwarves.
Yep. Charles C.K., is the obsessive literalism of the Dwarven oaths a corruption, or was it always like this even from the ancestor gods?
Yeah, pretty much. The dwarves are, their psyches very much work around this way of tackling the world. They are, using the word that we're using already, sort of obsessive, I suppose. But they get themselves stuck on fixed trammels, and that is how they work. And you go right back up to Grimnir himself. He did exactly the same thing. He swore his oath. He became the first Slayer and never came back from that. And that's pretty much as far back as you can go with dwarfs. That being the case, you'll probably find that the other dwarf ancestor gods, if they ever got the depth that they really deserve, and as it currently stands, no one's ever sat down and thought, actually, how are dwarfs different? Actually, how do these work? You'll probably find that each of the gods have got their own oaths wrapped up with them and who they are and what they represent, whether that's the oath of kingship, whether that's the oath of vengeance, whether that's a different oath on top of that, oath that Valea, for example, swore to protect and hold or holds carefully.
Yeah, the oath of hold, the oath of like clan, a bunch of other stuff like that.
And how do these represent and what do they mean? And it speaks to the dwarf character. And there's multiple examples in dwarven lore where once a dwarf swears an oath, they often not only get completely stuck in it, but won't die. They just keep going. And it's not just they're too stubborn to die, ha ha ha, it's a funny joke. There is something special about the dwarf oath, and I'm pretty sure we're going on to that.
Ricky Chapman, we played a dwarf brewer from Zufbar who made a brew called Grimazul Grund in celebration of the death of a vampire who tried to siege the hold, the men of the Empire, and dwarfs drank it dry. Oh, that sounds very appropriate. Fun.
That sounds utterly appropriate. As we mentioned right at the beginning of the introduction, Bugman, according to one version of the lore at least, literally created a new brew to celebrate the reformation of Bugman's Rangers, because Bugman's Rangers had gone around the world, done all sorts of crazy stuff, and the only one left alive was Bugman himself. The rest of them had died. died. And Bugman, an older dwarf, had dragged himself down to a king and asked for support. And then the king, upon giving him the support, he created a new beer entirely, Bugman 9X in this particular case, and created it to celebrate the reformation of the Rangers, and then fucked off to not do any brewing at all, but to continue with his vengeance with his new Rangers, and then disappeared out to go do his new thing. So using beers or creating a mastercraft to creating something new to celebrate something is deeply Dwarven in general. And that goes all the way back to earlier editions, not just the current editions of Warhammer.
Yes. So, Bugman and why he's important is really boils down to beyond like the jokes and like the dwarf beer character, the beer character. He's got a restaurant named after him. Oldest character in Warhammer, not just fantasy, but just Warhammer. So imagine Bugman, right? We are dealing with a dwarf who is not a beardling anymore. He's somewhere in the ballpark of 100 to 200 years old, or is mid 100s.
I'd argue.
Possibly older. And he has been traveling as part of a long, successful career. He goes to see the Emperor, whoever the Emperor was at the time. And he's on his way home on this long trek with some of his buddies. And you have to remember that Bugman's Brewery was not just like a brewery. This was a fortified building where his family lived, where workers lived that worked for the family. It was a clan. This was a whole clan of dwarves that lived in this very large building. If you actually go play Warhammer Online Age of Reckoning, Bugman's Brewery is actually a building that you fight over in one of the PvP zones, and it's actually a really, really solid structure that I have died in many times. But he comes home, and one of the story about it that I love is Bugman is on this cart being pulled by a pony with some of his few buddies, and they're coming their way up through the hills leading to the foothills of the mountains, because it's upriver a good way, and you actually have to go up to get to the foothills. And he sees this trail of smoke in the air, and the first thing Bugman thinks to himself is, okay, so the chimney needs to be swept, because the ash and stuff coming out of it is like really, really dark. Shouldn't be like that, but we haven't cleaned it in a while. Whatever, it's not a big deal. And the closer he gets, the more this gnawing sense is coming at him that there are things that aren't quite adding up right. Things are a little weird. And he finally turns the corner and comes upon ruin. Of that, this wasn't just, when you kind of read the story, it's easy to kind of just mouse over it as a group of goblins attack a building and skitter off after drinking the beer. Haha. But this is a massacre. He comes around the corner, and his home that his father built, and it is everything he has, everything his clan has, everything that a dwarf is supposed to protect is gone. It's burned, blackened. There are corpses all over the place of his family members, his friends. There are lots of dead goblins too, but clearly not enough dead goblins. And the desecration of the goblins was ultimate. Of that, goblins are horrible. They eat corpses, they maul them, and like do terrible things to the dead to in service of their humor. Instead of just looting the ale, a lot of the casts were just wasted, just shattered open for the sake of fun, which to a dwarf is like the worst kind of spoilage. Is it worse to have a goblin drink it for it to just be thrown on the ground and desecrated? There's probably not an answer, but it's bad. And the horror of witnessing death, a lot of torture for the people that were captured. And not only that, but as Bugman is taking stock, realizing that not all the bodies are accounted for, there are people missing. Yeah. And realizing that the goblins have taken his family, though his father died. Zamundsen was killed or died before that, because Bugman takes over the brewery before then. But the rest of his
it depends
family,
on the version of the story.
Yeah, it depends on the version of the story. Yeah. But his entire family is wiped out. The Bugman line that is his direct. So there are Bugmans that are like cousins and stuff.
Cousins and the like.
But his particular branch of the family, with the exception of him, is either completely exterminated or has been captured by greenskins. And you may note that this is very, very similar to the story of Gorfang Rotgut and what happened down at Katakazul. It's a very similar story, except for this one was more total in its destruction. Where Karakazul, Gorfang was able to kidnap some people. he tortured the king's son, but otherwise the hold was completely fine. You know, he had to run away before they discovered him. In this case, it was like the hold had been razed to the ground. There was nothing left. And Bugman literally is described as just getting so beyond the pale of what we could conceptually imagine as grief and rage that the only thing he can do is just scream out oaths of vengeance.
Yeah, I think there's a story here that is worth making relatively clear, and in some respects I feel that the story that's presented in Age of Sigmar undermines it. And that's that we've got a dwarf who is so horrified by everything that has occurred that he swears an oath of such depth that he will never be coming back from it. This is not a man who's going, I am off to find my lost wife, my daughter, my son, my family member who has been taken. It very much suggests that any living family members that he had were killed and their bodies were staked up, sitting on towers of crap, as goblins do love creating, perhaps attached to a great shrine that they have built to Gork or Mork, sitting inside the brewery now. In some way, he is left distraught, absolutely distraught, and he is left in a position where he could very easily swear a Slayer oath if he wished to do so. I think he is definitely there, but he goes further because a Slayer oath speaks to a complete loss from his perspective of his honor. He doesn't feel like his honor is lost. He didn't actually do anything wrong. You could argue he didn't protect those around him, but I think in his particular case, the opposite is the case. He doesn't want to just do the best that he can with what little is left of his life and try to give it as dearly as possible. He wants to kill every single fucking greenskin that there is. That's what he wants to do. He wants his vengeance. This is, in many respects, a different religious choice. One religious choice would be to follow in the footsteps of Grimnir and to swear the oaths of Grimnir. He doesn't. He swears oaths of vengeance, and he swears that he will bring down every single last one for what they have done to his work, to his masterwork, to his family, to his heart, to his soul, and he will never ever be done. It is such an abiding oath, and I think speaks to oaths in general amongst dwarf kind, something that in some respects have only really been tickled at by the various books in a fashion that really doesn't nail it down. I was really hoping, for example, that inside the Dwarf's Player Guide they would have an entire section on oaths and the importance of oaths to dwarfs. But as is often the case with dwarfs, they tend to not deal with the stuff that is different and alien about them, and they sort of run away from it and try to leave it to the fiction to deal with, which is, I feel, in this particular instance, something that could have been done differently.
Yeah, and one of the things that I really want to dive down on here is that Bugman is the perfect, I think, character, except for the only other character I would consider equivalent would be the King of Katakazul, of showcasing that when dwarves hit that limit, it's not always Slayer. Yeah. There are different avenues. There are different paths where this is actually a very similar story to Gotrek Gurnison, which of course we did a stream on. But of course in Gotrek's story, Gotrek goes on to do a terrible sin in his anger, which is that's why he takes the Slayer oath, not finding his family murdered by greenskins. But for Bugman, you have this fascinating thing where his oath of vengeance is so all-consuming that one of the there are two little quotes in regards to the lore from him that I really, really love that really show how kind of badly it fucks him up. Because once again, like, and you see this in the Age of Sigmar version, a lot of people get so caught up with the beer and brewery part that they miss the person, the dwarf behind it. Of that, one of the things I love that shows up in several editions is it always talks about that Bugman and his rangers will appear places, and they're these very disheveled, bloody dwarfs that make other dwarfs genuinely uncomfortable. That it always talks about they're dwarfs with a weird glint in their eye. where other Dawi will look at them and go, so, I don't know what's up with these Rangers, but something is wrong with them. Like, I don't want to be around them because they're not Slayers. So, like, I don't have to deal with that cultural thing, but there is something about them that is so unnerving that it's genuinely, like, Longbeards go, something is, like, off with these guys. I don't know what it is, and it's because they're so badly damaged. One of my favorite quotes about Bugman is that it mentions that Bugman was walking beside, I think, some dwarfs that got caught up with his rangers, and the non-Bugman's rangers heard him literally just muttering over and over to himself, "We'll take one clan, then the next, or we'll kill one tribe, then on to the next,
and then next,
and then
he's
the
just
next."
mumbling to himself. He's a proper, absolutely channeled towards one end goal psychopath. There is nothing else that matters to him. He is absolutely concentrated on one outcome. And if you're one of his rangers, you are going to be the same, or you are not going to be with him. So it does suggest that those who are with him may have even sworn the same oaths. In fact, I would probably argue that to become one of his rangers, you would have to swear the same oaths. The oaths to do whatever it takes to take down every single last Groby that passes your way. Goblin, for those of you who don't know your good old dwarfy tongue. Those goblins have to die.
Yeah, and like Andy said earlier in the stream, one of the things that's talked about with Bugman's story is in his literal genocidal mindset, this path of extermination. He gets to the point where the goblins aren't enough. He's very good at killing goblins. He's very efficient at it. He's killed a lot of goblin tribes in the Grey and Black Mountains. It talks about he moves into the wilderness beyond, of course, being the Badlands and even onto the Darklands. And it talks about that it grows. He can't just do goblins because he kills so many of them that he starts running out. So then he turns to orcs, and then he turns to trolls, and then he turns to hobgoblins. And he is, by dwarf standards, a genocidally obsessed dwarf whose only purpose in life is to exterminate the greenskins, which in and of itself is an endless, horrible task. And you can imagine how much he's reinforcing his trauma by the pursuit that he does, because he's constantly following these tribes around, going after them. And you may wonder, well, how do Bugman's Rangers stay full? Greenskins are horrible. And the all the joking aside, because there's a lot of jokes about them, which causes us to kind of forget how serious they are, of these horrible, nasty, people-eating monsters that have no sense of the only thing they enjoy is destruction and death. That is fun for them. And Bugman is constantly, he has cursed himself to where for a lot of battles, he shows up in time to save the day. You know, him and his rangers will just magically appear on a slope and they'll cause an avalanche, and like snow or boulders will come tumbling down and they charge down after it and they'll slam into the flank, or they'll shoot their crossbows and hit an orc war boss in the head or whatever. But just as often, they're too late. And they show up on battlefields where there's nothing but half-eaten, desecrated dwarf corpses, or they find little mining outposts or small family holdings that are burned out and everybody's dead, and there's dead children, there's dead wrens, there's dead dwarfs, and all he can do is pick up the survivors and like give them a look in the eye and say, "You're one of us now." And then
pretty much. I
going
think it's
onwards.
also it's worth noting that they are clearly people who are obsessed with the job that they are doing, and they, like the inglorious bastards, are hunting Nazis. And there is nothing that's going to stop them from doing this. And each and every one of them have got a trauma that have turned them to what they're doing, to swear the oaths that they have sworn. And it is a vengeance that can never end. They will fight for the rest of their lives. But it's also worth noting that these are not slayers. There's a few big differences here. Number one, they have not lost their honor, except in their own personal sense. They have not abjectly turned their back on Dwarven society and honor to fulfill their oath before Grimnir. That's not what they're doing. They're doing something quite different, which allows them to have a lateral guerrilla warfare ability that the Slayers never have. The Slayers go toe-to-toe with what's in front of them. They don't. They walk the shadows. They slit throats. They kill from afar. They are rangers. They are scouts. They are those who move between the rocks, the boulders of the mountains, and pick off from afar, murdering one by one by one until there's no greenskins left. Doing so by what many dwarfs would consider to be almost, but not quite, deceitful routes towards their outcomes. They do not take the toe-to-toe version that the Slayers do. They will run away. They will come back another day. They will hold on to their grudges and very carefully skirt round until eventually they will win in the end. They are quite different to Slayers. The oath they have sworn, this oath of vengeance, is as all-consuming, as deep, as meaningful, and almost certainly means that if a writer came along one day and went, you know what, we should have special rules for this oath in the same way we have special rules for the oath as Slayer, it would absolutely make sense. They haven't done so yet.
Come on, cancel the Empire book. Come on, cancel the Empire book.
I would strongly suggest that it is a yet, because one day someone's going to sit down and they're going to realize that it should occur. If I'd still been Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay producer and I did the Dwarf book, this would have happened, because I have long seen this as a quite clear development of where the dwarf psyche goes, because it's established in the lore very clearly. Just take anyone who's sworn oaths and their obsessions in terms of dwarves. Crag the Grim, for example, he's not over 1,000 years old because he just happens to have good genes. He's 1,000-year-old because he has sworn a particular oath that means he will not die until he fulfills it. We can go right back to the War of the Beard and the Dwarf King at the night time, whose name suddenly escapes me. That's
Snorri
really
Whitebeard.
annoying. Was it Snorri?
Oh,
No. Who concluded the War of Vengeance?
Oh, sorry. Go check Starbreaker.
Thank you. Go check. That's it. Who swore his oath that he would see the dwarfs winning that and died the day that they did, because his oath was fulfilled. And everything that had been building up came to an end and stopped. There's multiple examples of this inside dwarf lore. And basically we have the same here for Josef Bugman. Josef has sworn an oath. He will go on arguably forever until he is struck down in combat, facing presumably the greenskins that he so despises.
Yep. We're going to dive into another thing here in a second, but I want to get caught up on Super Chats real quick. Theo Benara, can you carve or burn dwarf runes into flesh? You could. They wouldn't do anything.
They wouldn't do much. Runes require something of strength to take them on. Magical runes, and if we're just talking normal dwarf runes, you can put them anywhere you want. You can tattoo them into something, it'd be fine. But if you're looking for something to hold magic, it needs to be able to hold and effectively contain that magic. Flesh is not enough for this, outside of some weird function that is yet to be described anywhere. I'm sure we could get a dwarf tattoo artist who could also pass runes down in some weaker form, almost certainly. I'm sure that could make a super fun career. We could build that and it would make sense within the world. But as it stands, the answer to this is not really. Yeah.
We've got Christopher Clayton here. Have we talked about how there are carts of Zamnil Bugman's 6X in the old world? They are very good in game, by the way. I actually forgot about that, but that's a really, really cool fun fact. That's actually one of the new units I really like in the old world. The carts of Zamnil Bugman's 6X. Yeah, that's great.
Yeah, it's great. I mean, there's nothing else to say other than that's great. It does contextualize how long Zamnil has been in the area, though. And because that would suggest that Zamnil holds and creates that brewery at least... probably what, 2250? No, earlier. Yeah, 2250 would do. At least then.
Which that would reinforce our thing of Bugman probably being in like the 200 plus.
Oh,
age
definitely.
Range.
I think the Bugman's age that presented in Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay 1 doesn't make proper sense with the character we have and also the new lore that we have being added. So Zamnil doing that And then Bugman taking over sometime around about the 2400s, somewhere around there. Then Grom sweeping through the brewery holding against Grom, because I think that in many respects speaks to why Git Guzzler wanted to take it down, because Grom passed through and didn't take it. Okay, and then it gets taken. Now, with different versions of the background, we have Zamnil dying either at the point when the brewery is taken down or previous, and I think if we go the most recent lore, Zamnil dies before, and Josef Bugman takes over. So that suggests that Josef Bugman has family inside that brewery when Git Guzzler comes in and completely ravages it. And I think that we are in a position where Joseph could easily swear an oath of the Slayer, but he chooses a different route. He chooses a route where he will chase down the greenskins, and I think that there's a reason for that, because they have got people that are his responsibility. If he took the oath of the Slayer, he turns his back on dwarf society. He chooses not to turn his back on that. He chooses to go after those that he has lost. The oath of the Slayer is utterly inappropriate for him. The oath of vengeance, however, 100% on point.
Yeah, but yeah, I actually like this development.
Yeah, it's good. I think it's great.
Jonathan Scott, when Gotrek first tries whiskey, he didn't know what it was and was shocked that humans could make it. Do dwarfs not have whiskey canonically? I mean, they could. It's just Gotrek might not have encountered
Not only
it.
do they could, they do in multiple examples of the previous background, but often for dwarfs from, say, Albion or some equivalent. So we're talking dwarfs who are outside the standard Karakankor model, and it's often far older versions of the lore.
It might be like Norskin dwarfs. Yeah.
And that kind of thing, exactly. So we're talking dwarfs who are separated from the standard Karakankor. The Karakankor seems to be very focused upon a very ale-based society. But do they have forms of other alcohols? I think the answer has to be yes. You can't imagine that it's not, particularly because some of the background very much says that they have a host of other alcohols, particularly if you just go into a dwarf tavern in any particular comic or in any particular white dwarf. They've got tons of stuff. So the answer is yes, but whiskey per se, I think, has been very much separated out to Albion expressions of how it works. So Albion is where you get that from.
Gun for Bullets. I was wondering, do the Dawizar also take oaths like the Dawi? Did they get rid of it? No, they still have oaths.
Yeah, they do.
Remember, Dawizar are a perversion of dwarf culture, not a complete other thing.
And much of what would have originally been their oath-based culture has been replaced by religion as well, concerning Hashat. So you could argue that they've got more. It's not just simply this core component of their psyche. That part of their psyche hasn't moved on, but they have more on top of that, because they have divested much of what outsiders might dismiss as secularism in terms of their ancestor worship, and they have taken on other aspects indeed. Although if you go watch our Hashat stream, which I do recommend, it wasn't Hashat, was it? Was it Hashat?
It was Zarnagrund.
It was Zarnagarund. It wasn't Hashat. Go watch our Zarnagarund stream if you haven't done so already, because we come up with a pretty heretical view of what Hashat might be. But I think if you take that view on, then the Dawizar are just like the dwarves.
Yep, and for good reason. And and just like a very quick, easy example, the Infernals is literally a Hashut perversion of the Slayer Oath.
Straight.
But we talk about that in that stream, so be sure to go check that out. Dick Banner, Gels did nothing wrong. Morathi is Dami Mommy. It can cause my spirit animal, and I will make the Lorebeards Lore Crimes collaboration happen. Sure. Also, please seek psychological help.
Harsh, poor dank matter. Like Josef Bugman, you need help.
Mr. Grumbler. So how genetic or cultural is the grudges and oaths of the dwarfs? What is the reason for it? So I don't know. Genetic.
Genetic.
I don't know if that's exactly the term I would use. It is. It's a. How do I?
Do you want to go?
No, you go first. I'm still thinking of how I word it.
Okay, so culturally, it's part of their entire makeup. It's how they work. Their grudges, their oaths. But that's because that mentally dwarves are different to humans. Now, we often use humans as the, let's say, baseline because we understand them. We know humans because we are human. And we understand how a human psyche works. And we also understand when a human psyche goes beyond the norm. Neurodivergence. Okay, people who think differently and approach the world differently. All dwarves are, in comparison or by human standards, neurodivergent. All of them. Every single last one. But their baseline is what we would consider to be neurodivergent. The same is for halflings, the same is for elves, the same is for all the species. They are different. And the baseline for dwarves is what we would consider to be deeply obsessive, deeply concerned about the finest minutiae of detail. And that regards both the social way of approaching the world and also the quite literal manifestations of how they work with their skills, how they create things. They get really obsessed over the details. They are craftsmen, and that speaks to their obsessive natures. And when it goes wrong, they get hurt. And that hurt, that damage, that psychic damage, is dealt with through their oaths and through attempting to replicate their ancestors who, as far as they're concerned, did it right, did it better. They are deeply traditional people, and they look back to their ancestors for help, for an understanding of how to approach the world. And when they are broken and they realize that they can't continue on, they look outwards and they see that others before them have also been broken, and this is what they did to deal with it. And they do the same. And they replicate what their ancestors did. They are very much ancestor worshippers. And it's not just a matter of they go to a shrine and they worship their ancestors. They replicate them in their work. They look at the works of their grandfathers, their great-grandfathers, their grandmothers, their great-grandmothers, and they attempt to be as good as them, to be something that they would look down on with pride. And when that pride is broken, they have to do something, and it is built into their culture to attempt to fix it. And the way they generally fix it is either, if it's too much, swearing oaths; if it's not too much, dealing with their grudges and fixing it step by step by step so they can then move on. Loosely speaking, they are, as far as humans are concerned, way beyond the exceptional pale as far as psyches are concerned, because they are so obsessive over stuff that humans will just move on from. The dwarves are still worrying over about that thing that happened like 50 years ago when they said something wrong, and they're still worrying about it. Or someone did something against them, and their third cousin said something at a party that made him feel like the entire party went wrong. And he's still holding a grudge in his heart about that thing, and it needs to be resolved. But the other important thing about dwarves that's different to humans is that when it's resolved, they move on. When they score off that grudge, it is culturally important for them to then move on from that grudge. And some grudges can never be properly resolved. So, loosely speaking, your answer here is it genetic? Not sort of really, but it kind of is built into their psyche and the way that dwarves think. But it is absolutely cultural because of the way dwarves think.
I would agree and say that in that sense, you could argue that it's how they cope with how they are genetically, how they're built, how they approach the world, and the way that they were shaped by the old ones, if you want to look at it that way, or the way that chaos has affected them after they were shaped by the old ones. It's how they deal with things. In the sense that a lot of humans use various methods to deal with the real world.
You won't be the first thing like that. Yeah.
The easiest way I'll put it is, one of the things that Warhammer has done exceptionally well with the dwarfs, in my opinion, is despite the fact that sometimes they are very over the top, there are a lot of them that when you really just start to describe them, it's not unusual to see a person in the audience go, oh no. Oh no!
Yeah, totally. I mean, dwarves are just a different baseline psychology, which to humans would be seen as neurodivergent, which means that some people are going to be relatively similar to dwarves, because in humanity, our neurodivergence goes in a host of different directions. I mean, I'm pretty neurodivergent myself, so yeah.
Yeah. Godzilla, thank you for the super chat. Are there any stories of humans being saved by dwarfs and in return they swore an oath to help the dwarves till death? Yep, happens more than you think. Even if the dwarves don't believe the situation or are proven wrong, seeing the humans die doing what they said. So I'll give a very blunt. If you go read Road of Skulls, there's a human you meet in that book who is literally that. Felix and Gotrek's
Felix.
relationship is basically
Is
this.
that. Yeah, Felix. If you want a very famous example, just look at Felix. Felix has effectively given his life over to Gotrek in exactly this situation. So, is there examples of this? Absolutely. Humans will express in almost every way that not only humanity can, but as you would expect, there's going to be some who hold on to things that have nothing to do with them, just because that's how they think. Humanity is often the most diverse in terms of how they're approached in most fantasy worlds, and that's because they will do a little bit of what everybody else does. And the answer to this one is absolutely yes.
Yep. Gun for bullets. So can a strong devotion to an oath give dwarfs a kind of power up? Yeah. Yes,
Yeah.
it can. It can allow dwarfs to push beyond what they otherwise would not be able to.
Yeah, absolutely. Consider it like the old initial discussions during the Incredible Hulk TV show. And I know that this is a really weird and specific example, but I'm going to call that one out because I remember when I was a kid watching this show with Bruce Banner walking around like a bum from place to place, fixing problems, often as the Hulk, as Lou Ferrigno came out. But there was a nice little discussion in that where they were saying that people in times of stress were able to lift up cars that they could never normally lift. And that is what started down his experimentations in trying to replicate this. And dwarfs are that. When they reach a point of stress and they swear in a way that is quite absolutely different to a human oath. A human oath might be something you desperately try to adhere to. For a dwarf, when they swear it, that is it. It's done. They are focused on this shit now, and because of that, they are capable of more than the others, but they're also incapable of other things. They can't function inside standard society in the same way other dwarves are because they're off doing their thing. If you, for example, you swear an oath of kingship, you're fucked. You're staying in the hold, being a king, because you have to be. Your entire life is dominated by being the leader for your people that you can be. And when your spouse or your family come up and say, hey, let's do this stuff, I'm busy. I'm being a king. And it's the same for your slayers. I'm off to do my slayer. Hey, slayer, will you do this? No, I'm a slayer. I'm going to get drunk, so I'm sad, and I'm going to kill something next week. They're all caught up with their individual oaths, assuming that they've got them. And once they're stuck in that path, they kind of can't get out, but it does bring benefit. And we have examples of this directly in the rules of the game. If you take a look at slayers, for example, slayers get special rules for killing shit. And that's because they're so dedicated to killing shit. In a similar fashion, Josef Bugman quite clearly should have special rules for never backing down from a fucking goblin. In the same way that, for example, the Slayers have immunity to psychology because nothing scares them. Their oaths power them in a way that is quite simply beyond what humans can ever manage or manifest by doing the same things.
Yeah, one of the things, my favorite example will always be hiking Alricsson. So hiking Alricsson at the battle at the gates of Kislev, he dies. He is dealt a mortal wound by a greater demon, and he's going to die. That, like, he's dead. He's a dead man walking. But he swears an oath that he will not die until someone else has been chosen to take the throne, because he does not have a direct heir, and he decides, because all of his sons die in the battle as well. And so he's like, until we decide who the next king is, I'm not going to die. And he stays alive for exactly 1 year to the day when they pick Thorgrim Grudgebearer as king, and then he immediately dies.
Yeah, and I think this is something you should consider. If you're out there creating your own dwarf characters for Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay, or if you're thinking how they could best manifest, whether you're the GM or the player, simply think of it as, if I swear an oath, there's no comeback, ever. Don't try to think of ways to get around it. Don't think, oh, I could do this and that would sort of make it fulfill. No, dwarfs don't think like that. They're not looking for a get out clause. They're looking to fulfill their oath, and often, once it's fulfilled, die. And that's the scary part in terms of it being a character, because often the fulfillment of an oath means that their life is now complete. For a slayer, their life is complete when they die. For a king, their life is complete when they die. There's a host of different oaths, and generally speaking, if you want to use oaths in your game, I would suggest that you build like 4 or 5 core oaths, because I know that's certainly what I've done for my game, whether that's the Oath of Kingship, Oath of Vengeance, the Oath of the Slayer, for example, and how they reflect for your characters. And then you could underpin that or provide a new foundation of maybe like a bunch of smaller oaths, and then just build yourself a nice simple rule for what they do inside your games.
Yeah, so just a fun little aside to add to that. So one of the things they did that I like in the Dwarf Player's Handbook, because they almost got where we want them to be, and I'm hoping they'll go the rest of the way with the next Dwarf book that's coming out in like a year or so. But they added in a system of you don't have ambitions with Dwarf players. They don't have ambitions. They have grudges. And you keep track of grudges, and you have this other thing. But the way I would suggest it is think of grudges as like your short-term ambitions. These are things that can be achieved feasibly. Now, some of them might be a little more extreme, like there are small grudges, big grudges, but oaths are your big long-term ambition. Like oaths are you will never accomplish this. And if you do, your character will smile contentedly as he finally sits down to rest a little bit, close his eyes, and when the players check on him next, he passed away.
He's gone. Yeah.
Which
so,
adds...
Yeah, I think that's actually a pretty good way of dealing with long-term goals if you want. If you're looking to build your own rules, though, I would suggest that you just replace all of your religion rules with oaths. I know that's what I've done for my game. It works.
Yep. Okay, getting through these real fast. Christopher Clayton, by the way, there are runic tattoos in the world.
Yes, all manner of runic tattoos.
Yeah, they did add special rules for runic tattoos for Slayer characters, which is nice.
And needed in some respects.
Yep, so very cool. What do they call? There's a joke in D&D about magic tattoo, mattoos. Everybody hates that word. Someone's like mattoos. Everyone's like, don't call them that.
I don't know that, nor do I want to. I'm never going to hear that again. It's not banned from my ears.
Only artist. Would it be possible to see rune golems or the constructs in Total War? Anything's possible in Total War. Anything.
Total War... I think it's possible, but I think it's not hugely likely because they are, broadly speaking, quite obscure. They're not common pieces of lore.
I'll put it this way. If they're going to do one more DLC, probably. But that's because they're very heavily desired by the community and there's some material supporting them. And we're scraping the bottom of barrels. We're really scraping barrels at this point.
Are you? I can think of tons of things that can be added to Total War. Literally tons.
I'm sure you could, but I don't think those things are kind of in the zeitgeist of the community plus the Total War developers.
No, that's fair.
I don't know if they're easily Googleable.
Well, as we've said before, the wikis and Google are absolutely lacking on tons of stuff.
I agree. But like the Runic Guardian artwork from the first edition book is so famous. Like that big golem with the axe hands and everything. It's such a cool piece. Plus, it shows up in the Wolf Rep starter set as well. Runic Guardian shows up in that, though there's something off about it. I won't say more. Theo Bonara, could a dwarf ever give up an oath? No.
Yeah, this is a classic human way of viewing a dwarf oath. It's not that they can't, it's that they won't. They just won't. To do so is utterly alien to them. It's just not how they think. It's not how they do things. And I want to give you a clean example of this so that we can go, okay, so it's sort of like that, I suppose. That seems extreme. And yeah, it kind of is. So can they give up an oath? I'm going to start by saying the only way that they could would be if they were properly, as far as dwarves are concerned, completely psychotic, completely outside of dwarven society, completely unlike another dwarf. So let's then flip that round and compare that to humans. Where do we do it? So let's be just really grim. Could a human ever wantonly kill children? The answer is, well, yes, they could, but they don't. We don't have humans. I mean, I can't think of a single example inside the city I'm in where that's occurred within the last 100 years, where you just wantonly kill children. It's not what happens. And in the same way, dwarfs don't break oaths because it is so alien to them. We don't kill children because that's alien to us. And that's a loose way of trying to imagine it. Think of something that is alien to you personally, and then go, would I not do that? Other people might, but I won't. And that's loosely a good area that you can go for your dwarfs and their oaths.
Yeah, and I would say that there have been dwarfs that do, and they become slayers.
Yeah.
Because that's the only recourse left.
Yeah, you'll find that occasionally does occur, but not often on an oath. Oaths are quite different to their day-to-day expression. So, for example, if you've got someone who is doing their best for their family, they're doing really hard, and they're desperately trying, they do something relatively dishonorable. Many would say, oh, well, you've kind of broken your promises to your family. Yeah, but it's not an oath. An oath is something that's fundamental to the dwarf character. When you swear something of such weight, you kind of never come back.
Yeah, and this is where I would say, and once again, go check out our stream on the two of them. This is what Gotrek did, and why Gotrek is so fucked up. Yeah, he is so badly damaged.
And that's part of that's why it's important that we have those characters, because
yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. Characters in novels, characters in your roleplay games are the exceptions. They are the crazy folk. They're the ones on the extreme. And they're the ones that tell the interesting stories. So the answer to this is no. But you will find that someone will write a character about it. Someone will write a story that dives into what occurs when you do. Because that's interesting and it speaks to things that are different to the norm. And that's good. But the general answer, Theo, is no.
I need someone to make a GIF of being Andy doing the well, no, but actually yes. It just saying like that's just Lorebeards in a nutshell.
Every week, don't we? We're like, that will never happen except it happens 9 times out of 10.
Yeah. 10,000 ants. Do orcs ever try to emulate rangers? Not widely, but
or
has
commandos.
Yeah. Would it theoretically be a thing? Absolutely.
Yeah. So 1,000 ants. The answer to this is yes, actually. But it's not in any of the books currently in any realistic sense. But emulating rangers or being something similar to them, orcs are some of the most adaptable, and greenskins in general, not orcs, but greenskins in general, are some of the most adaptable and unexpectedly capable species on the planet. And I will give you an example from Josef Bugman's own background. So in Josef Bugman's background, Josef tears away from his brewery to head off north to give the Emperor some special brew. And when he comes back on a big steam, I think it's a steamship with a big paddle wheel, he's making his way back down. He gets attacked by goblin pirates. And these goblin pirates are proper goblin pirates that make you go, arr. Now, they have not established this as a core component of their society because goblin pirates are a thing. It's because goblins ape, much like orcs do, ape many of the things that are around them frequently, particularly if it's capable. So would they emulate? Yes. And it won't happen until you get an individual situation where someone says, in this case, we've got orc rangers, and they work just like death commandos from 40k or some equivalent, where they're moving around like SES troopers, because that just happens to be how they're expressing in this instance. But broadly speaking, the bigger picture is no. Individuals, I think it would be impossible that there isn't some example of it somewhere.
Yep. Warrington Crescent, ambushes, avoiding direct combat, traps, range compared to their more normal, hard armored and hitty kin. Sounds like rangers learned how to fight like proper gobbos. I mean, that's
harsh, Warrington.
Don't say that where they can hear you.
Don't let Joseph hear you say that.
Holy Artists, are there oaths where Dawies don't die? Like an oath to be the best grandpa ever, and they live to. Well, yeah, it's not nothing quite so facetious as that. But Craig the Grim has been going for well over 1,000 years. He is stupid old for dwarf standards.
Yeah, because the oath that he has sworn is pretty much impossible to fulfill, which is to learn absolutely everything about runes, every single rune that could possibly exist ever, et al. He is never going to stop unless somebody literally bashes him in the head and he falls down dead. So the answer is yes, although, as Sotek mentioned, that is a bit frivolous. And dwarfs don't swear oaths for frivolous reasons. They swear oaths because they're almost incapable of doing anything else. And once they've sworn that oath, their life is forever stuck in that direction. It's stuck.
It's also worth Yeah, it's also worth noting that, to be very clear, dwarfs deeply understand how much gravitas there is behind an oath. Dwarfs do not, you don't be like, oh, dwarf, give me your oath on this, and dwarf be like, oh yeah, sure. Like, dwarves are, if you like bring up those kinds of language, like, give me your oath on this, they will sit and think for a bit very, very carefully, and many will probably just outright say no, of that I'm not going to do something so, because a human will throw around that term very lightly. And a dwarf will say, you do not understand what you are asking of me. I cannot do that.
Yeah, and I think it's worth saying that if you go looking through all the stories, you will find many examples of a dwarf who swears an oath to someone else. And we often view that in very human terms. We're like, okay, you're sworn to do it. But when the dwarf has sworn to do that, that means that dwarf will see it through. And if they don't, they owe for the rest of their life. That's it. That their life is gone. They now owe the person they have failed forever. Swearing an oath is not a small thing. Now, it may be an oath about a small thing, and sometimes dwarves will do that. And if that fails, their life as they know it has come to an end. It's also worth noting that when you're swearing an oath, you also have to balance it off against oaths you've already sworn. If you, for example, have sworn the oath of kingship to your hold, you can't swear that you will definitely do certain things, because if you do, it may contradict the oath of kingship that you have sworn. It's one of the reasons why the good old Slayer King is in all the trouble that he's in, because he's got two conflicting oaths going on all the time. The oath of kingship standing off against the oath of the Slayer, and they're not compatible at all. And that causes him enormous heartache, enormous trouble. He is a tragic figure, and poor old Ungrim Ironfist does not have it easy, nor does his entire family as it passes down. Watch our Slayer stream. So, loosely speaking on this one, are there oaths with dwarves don't die? Yes, loads of them. Do they swear oaths for frivolous reasons? Never. But to a human, it may appear frivolous. And that's something that's worth noting, because they might say, for example, I swear that I will ensure that you will be safe within this hold. A human might just go, oh, well, that's just the sort of thing you do for, inviting me in. No, now he's sworn it. You will be safe. That's it. And he will make sure that you are safe. And if it turns out that you're not, he owes you a life debt. That's how deep oaths are.
Yep. Watchdog, what are your thoughts on the new brewer career? Andy hasn't seen it yet. But I mean, looking at it,
I skimmed it. It's not how I would have done it, as I recall.
Yeah, it's not particularly crazy, or like bonkers, but it's
see, right. I can't recall if it's added, but if you're doing a brewer career, it requires a one-page set of rules for creating beers that provide benefits to your stats. Does it do that?
No, they added a new talent.
Then my answer is that the brewer career is underpowered. It should be something like an engineer career, where you get a bunch of engineering rules to create your own artifacts. A brewer career should give you rules for creating your own brews, which do things like providing you extra wounds if you drink it, providing you with courage, good old Marienburger courage should you take a swig, providing you with food if you happen to be a dwarf, meaning you don't need to eat provisions for however many weeks that you do it. There should be a bunch of rules for that. If there isn't rules for that, my thoughts are that there is a big patchy hole that should be filled by the rules as they currently stand.
Yeah, that would have been nice, and if I was GMing, I would definitely add it. Yeah, they added a new special rule where dwarfs can get a talent that gives them stat buffs from drinking like dwarf brews, but it's not part of like a brewing system. So they took a bit of too much of a shortcut on that, in my opinion.
Fair enough.
Tanner Jordan, sorry this is off topic, but how much money would it take to influence a win station for you to go over the fan project for Koresh? I mean,
horrified and excited.
Yeah, I need to speak with the guys behind it, because if we were going to do it, I want to have them here to chat about it instead of us just like guessing at like why they made certain kinds of decisions and stuff like that. But it's something it's on my to-do list. I want 2025 to have some pretty fun guests come onto the show because 2024 we kind of just enjoyed doing it just us the two of us, which
And
has
it
been
was
great and awesome.
Yeah.
But I'm gonna look to try, especially for Wednesday nights, try and occasionally have on some like special guests.
And on that, and in response to what Tanner was suggesting there, if you're sitting out there going, oh, I really wish you'd speak to such and such, or alternatively, if you know someone that you think would be a super cool guest for us to be discussing stuff with, reach out to them. We're happy for you to get us in contact with people and, loosely speaking, do some cool streams. As Sotek suggests, we're very, very open to that. We are looking to not just discuss the lore that we all know and love, but to look beyond it and what else has been created for Warhammer, what other things could be discussed around it, and extra guests are always going to bring in new opinions and new ideas. So we're not just open to that, we're 100% behind it.
Yeah, and to be very clear, I try not to bother people. So, like, if you have, like, somebody that you're like, man, I'd love to see this person on Lorebeards, reach out to them, whether you're a friend or a fan, be like, hey, you should hit up Loremaster of Sotek. Like, my Twitter DMs, my Discord DMs are always open to anybody at any time.
As are
so,
mine.
Andy. So, like, feel free to
I
hit
ignore
us up.
mine half the time.
Yeah, probably hit mine up. I'm a little faster at checking them, but
Good idea.
Yeah, we're happy to hear from people. Creme Gelto, the destruction of Lakato was an inside job by me, you piece of shit.
Creme Gelto. How
dare
could you?
How dare you break Andy's save button? That's surely what happened.
Oh man, it sucks. For those of you who don't know, we did a big Lizardman stream a few weeks back where we created an entire city for our Slam Mage Priest downwards. And I did a map during the course of that stream, which you can go watch on, whose channel is that one on? It's on one of our channels.
Mine.
Is that on your one?
But it's
so you can
also
go watch
podcast,
that over
right?
you can go watch that over on Sotek's channel if you wish to do so, or listen to it on the podcast if you're doing that. And I built a map throughout the course of that, but sadly that map has disappeared as I've covered in other streams, and I'm gonna have to redraw it. It makes me sad.
It'll be back sometime soonish. I'll keep bothering him.
I've got some actual work to do first. I'm currently working on a board game and an RPG game, so I'm going to do those first.
Like I said, at some
but
point.
we will get there. It will happen.
Actually, fun thing. If there's anyone out there that has similar software and wants to take a hack at it, I mean, you could
Go
do
for
that.
it.
Yeah, please. Actually,
I'm hyper lazy. I'm cool with that.
yeah. If somebody's got like a good drawing software and just wants to recreate the work Andy had done, because it's on stream, you can literally just watch him do it. Or
And
trace
there's
the lines or whatever.
also a low-res version of the map over on the LAWhammer Discord. If you pop over there into the, I think it's sitting inside the Lorebeards channel, actually, you'll find a copy of the map in there. It's low-res, but it gives you more than enough to go with.
I'll even pay you some money. Hit me up on DMs.
Holy crap.
Walk a tree.
Generous.
I'd like to get that sprint done. What would happen if a dwarf takes an oath based? Oh, this is a great question. What happens if a dwarf takes an oath based on misinformation, like they swear revenge on someone who's later proven to be innocent? Shit happens. That's what happens.
So this is important, and it's why swearing an oath is so deep, because once they've sworn it, they're stuck. They don't get out of it. There's no get out clause. There's no, oh, but it was a lie. And we covered this as an example over in the Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay starter set. I won't go into details about it. It's only a one-page adventure that sits at the back of the adventure book inside the starter set. And it speaks to the dwarf that is inside there, who is a slayer. And just to put the general idea out there, the slayer swore an oath based on a lie. And it does not stop them being a slayer, but it does cause heartache. And how you resolve that is up to you.
Yeah. So the juicy tragedy in this is you can have characters who say swore to kill a particular individual who ends up being innocent. If that dwarf does not want to kill that individual because they go, oh shit, I was wrong, I don't want to do this, that opens up usually that's your slayer oath. Like, because you have violated an oath and there's no getting out of it. Some dwarfs will go, I swore an oath, I'm going to kill this person.
Yeah.
Like, I understand you're innocent and I'm sorry, but I swore an oath, so I'm going to kill you.
Yep. And both of those outcomes might be unacceptable for the dwarf. You might find that he fulfills his first oath, kills them, and then becomes a slayer afterwards anyway, because they fulfilled an oath based on a lie. The dwarf psyches are sadly very, very fixed. And it causes deep emotional trauma for them. It's sad,
Yeah,
especially when it doesn't work.
I can't remember the name of the specific book, but there's a book either by Nick Kime or Gav Thorpe that is part of the old Dwarf Omnibus that talks about like a group of high elves reestablishing contact with the dwarves after the Age of Vengeance, and they try and smooth over relations, and it goes ugly. Because this scenario happens. There's an oath that is sworn that ends up being based on a lie, and it gets ugly because of that. And it's a really good book. I want to say it's Grudge Breaker or something like that.
I think it is too. I didn't want to say anything because I'm not sure it is.
Well,
I was like, that's Grudge Breaker, isn't it? It's in the Dwarf Omnibus.
I just knocked over so many books. It is I think it's Oathbreaker.
Oathbreaker, okay, fair
so
enough.
It's either Oathbreaker or it's Ancestral Honor. I'm pretty sure it's one of those two. I don't remember exactly.
I can't remember which one it is.
Which one? But feel free to look those up. It'll have elves mentioned in it. I'm pretty sure it's Oathbreaker. But anyway, so carrying onwards, we have Phil here. So if you talked about who did the hut on Bugman's Brewery, it was Get Guzzler. Yeah. Get Guzzler, which there's very little detail about him. He's a goblin that apparently drank a lot, obviously, and aimed to be another Grom. He was a bit of a fat goblin, but he wasn't near the size of Grom because he didn't have the whole troll.
They did a conversion from Grom, as I recall in the article. It's ages ago since I read that. You're talking White Dwarf 298 up to White Dwarf 302. Somewhere in there, you'll get your background for Get Guzzler. Go check that one out. There's not a great deal, as Sotek says, written about it. Get Guzzler is basically a wannabe Grom. And as I recall, they even converted him directly from Grom, although that might be not correct. It's been a while since I read that.
And then it says
Andy sure they did.
Mentioned them. What was Captain Skybend's role in all this?
Oh, cripes, I can barely remember. Captain Skabend. He's almost certainly one of the ones that attacked the dwarf. I'd have to go read it.
Well, I was going to say, I assume that's the River Pirate Goblin.
Yeah, indeed. I can't remember. It's been a while since I read it. I need to go back. I can remember some of the dwarves. You had Skeggy Threxen, and Bazrak Bolgan was right at the very beginning. Skeggy Threxen was possibly the captain of the ship. I can't remember the full role in that one. But as I recall,
he attacked. So Captain Skabin led the River Rats attacked the Seahawk, a barge commanded by Grim Grunson. Then later on the River Soul, he launched an attack against a different river barge carrying Josef Bugman and captained by his old enemy, Grim Grunson.
Grim Grunson, there you go. Okay, and that's where you get your good old dwarfy pirates.
He had a very fun mini. He had a hilarious looking mini.
Yeah, they're all conversions from existing minis. There's one that's got a really nice little peg leg, for example, which is super cool. There's not much else to say. Most of the background
shows up for that and then never appeared ever again.
And then never appears again. Yeah, totally.
Darius Rose, how does a dwarf ranger compare combat stealth-wise to human scouts as well to elves such as Deepwood / Shadow elves and shades? So
as much as I don't want to say it, the elves will dance rings around them in terms of stealth.
Yeah. They're better than you would expect.
Yes.
But they are not as like bullshit as an elf, but they're probably better than a lot of humans, unless it's like a very experienced human.
One of the mistakes that many people make with dwarves is thinking that they are clumsy, unagile as a species, and whilst that might be the case for many, that is not the case for all. Having said that, though, humans in general are more agile. Elves are significantly more agile on top of that. They are well-trained dwarves. And that means that they are better than your basic elf and your standard human. But the peak elf scout will be miles ahead of what the dwarf rangers are. Having said that, though, on top of that, the dwarf rangers will still surprise and occasionally even make an elf go, well, I didn't expect that dwarf to be there. But do try to keep everybody grounded in their own individual areas, because sometimes some writers will go, I'm going to make them all better than everything else, as you get power creep moving in. They're good guys at what they do, but they're not better than what you'd expect from peaks from the other species.
Yeah, I would say the thing that sets Dwarf Rangers apart in a really fun way is that they use very aggressive tactics for scouts, and that they're really big on like causing rockfalls, avalanches, redirecting monsters into hordes, stuff like that. They have some pretty fascinating strategies because they're very aggressive. They're not just like, oh, I'm going to get eyes on this and report back to my boss. A lot of the time, they are taking a lot of action themselves.
I'll go further than that and say that not only that, but they're also very aware of their own shortcomings. If you're, for example, working against elves, you're aware of their extraordinary eyesight, their extraordinary hearing that is peak hearing and peak eyesight in comparison to most, which means that's how you work. Your guerrilla warfare will be taking that into account, which means that because they're good at their job, they'll be able to surprise elves, they'll be able to surprise humans, they'll be able to surprise any species because they're aware of what their opponents can do and they'll work around that. They're good at their job.
Yep. Holy Artist, would human traders specify to Dawi that something is a human oath or a Dawi oath? I think the dwarfs would probably, realistically, a dwarf would probably correct the human's use of language. I would think of like a dwarf trader being like, I can like make a guarantee in the delivery of this contract, but let's not use the term oath here. But I'm curious what your thoughts are on that, because I could see that being something that gets brought up of a human being like, hey, I need like a promise in the form of this deal that we're making that you're going to do XYZ and I'll do ABC. Of a dwarf being like, well, that's kind of a hefty ask.
Yeah, dwarves are quite literal as a species. They don't really do metaphor. They understand metaphor. Metaphor can be used in a host of ways, but they don't do metaphor. What we consider to be standard idiomatic use of a language, dwarves tend to avoid. They state things as they are. And when a human trader, for example, comes to them and makes a request, the dwarf will take it almost certainly at face value. Now, human traders worth their salt will be aware that if they make demands of a dwarf, the dwarf will probably see it through. And if they make the wrong sort of demands, they're going to get into trouble because the dwarf's going to expect them to be doing the same things in turn. And they're going to get angry when it doesn't go right. To a degree, we covered this when we were working our way through the Looks Could Kill adventure, where we've got ourselves a dwarf who expected humans to act like dwarfs when they were dealing in business. And that's when they gave their word, they expected it to be seen through. It fails, the dwarf loses almost everything, and it causes problems that are the instigating moments for the adventure at hand. And eventually that dwarf, come the end of the adventure, swears a slayer oath because it goes so out of control. So I think that when humans are dealing with dwarfs, as long as both are experienced, they'll be aware of the shortcomings of the other species and their inability to deal with certain types of business. But if you're dealing with a dwarf that's only used to dealing with dwarfs, or a human that's only used to dealing with humans, we're going to have problems.
Yeah, and that being said, there are some dwarves that are like, they're used to dealing with humans, so they have a much fuzzier line when it comes to certain things. Like, oh yeah, I made a promise, but I made a promise to a human, so it's kind of
in many respects as well, it'll be, I think it'll be more, I'm not promising that. Yeah,
there are also some dwarves. Yeah, there are also dwarves that are of the roguish pursuit. That are liars, to put it very bluntly. Like if you in the Uberschreck starter set, there's a really nasty group of dwarves you can run into. I'm not gonna say who they are for spoiler reasons, but you could easily go through Uberschreck thinking all the dwarves are the best, most trustworthy guys. But there's one particular group that will fuck you over so hard because they prey on that. They're like, oh yeah, we're dwarves, wink. But even they have a level of truthfulness to them.
Absolutely.
Where the contracts they use the fine print trick, but they write it in Khazalid so people don't realize. Yeah, they don't realize it's fine print and they can't read it. And the dwarves are like, oh, don't worry about it. It's fine. we're dwarves. We wouldn't do anything duplicitous.
Yeah, absolutely. Try not to think of all of these species as monoliths because they're not. There's always examples that sit on the periphery. And when, for example, I was in a position where I was asking people to create this stuff, I was always conscientious of the fact that we had a stereotype and the norm for a species, and we were looking at showing how that norm could express in different ways. And Sotek gives one example of how that norm can express, because not all dwarves are entirely above board. But they should be, but they're not all.
Yeah. Necromancer Cobalt, what do you think dwarf ale and Bugman's specific taste like? Like, what flavor and aroma notes do you think dwarfs prefer? I don't know, probably something earthy, you would guess in a lot of cases. But it would depend on your personal experience, and then going from there. Like, I don't drink alcohol, I just don't. So I'm just making shit up on the fly. But when you read the books, a lot of the time you'll notice what the writer's preferences are when it comes to certain beverages, because it will be reflected in their writing.
Yeah, I agree with that completely. It's a very subjective experience. And you'll find that creatives work around what they know and sometimes forget to look outside of their own pegged out areas that they understand. Now, unlike Sotek, quite happy to take a tipple every once in a while. And whilst I may not like beer, I do like other things, and I have drunk beer in the past. And the flavors and aromas and the notes, I would suggest should speak to, if, for example, you're doing it in roleplay, the players at hand and you. What you feel speaks to the sort of character that you're attempting to portray. If the dwarf, for example, is particularly spiky or has a very hard line, you could then reflect that in the type of alcohol that they're drinking or how you describe the things that they have. If you want to reinforce the nature of dwarfs and that stone and steel nature of them, you could add very strong metallic tastes to the beers or the ales at hand. You could add earthy tastes, as Sotek suggests there, something that speaks to the land and the stone from where they come. Or perhaps, if you wanted, you could go slightly further and say that there's a lot of fungus in much of the beer that they're working with, rather than the grains that you might expect because of where they have grown their particular crops or whatever else it might be. So loosely, I would suggest the storytelling is more important than the fact in this particular instance, and go with the storytelling that suits you best.
Yeah, that being said, who knows? Maybe one day there will be a Games Workshop official Warhammer Fantasy cookbook with all sorts of dwarf brewing things in there, and you can go, oh, official answers, and whatever.
Well, as I said, I've drunk Bugman's brew more than once, and Bugman's beer was, in every case, a very heavily sedimented, old-school ale.
Yep, there you go. Morning Crescent, I sort of want to see a dwarf who swears an oath of vengeance against a champion of chaos becomes a demon prince, just to see how far he'd be willing to go to kill an immortal. Yeah, that would make for a pretty great, awesome story, and it's definitely happened.
So, Mornington, I think actually you're speaking to one of the stories of Warhammer. And by that I mean, Warhammer creates lots of situations by the various species that it builds and the cultures and the world building that are in place. And then when you see an immovable rock hit that hard place, you're immediately left with an interesting conflict that can start the basis of a fun story. That is one of them.
I mean, hell, just to expand on that further, a really fun wolf rip idea for a character could be someone who's a direct descendant, like 10 generations down from a father or a mother that swore this oath. So it's been passed down through the generations to kill some immortal demon. And so he's like, I don't even know what this thing is. I've heard about it. I've been told about it all my life. I know I have to destroy it. I don't know how. I don't even know what it looks like. But I know I'm supposed to get it somehow. And that's something that like hangs over them of like, I don't want to pass this down to my kids. I got to find a way to resolve this.
To the firstborn each time.
Yeah.
And also it's worth noting that as much as we often talk about dwarves passing down to the firstborn, most dwarfs don't have kids.
Yeah, a lot don't.
Get that into your mind. A number of females to male in terms of ratio for dwarfs is really low. So you find that most male dwarfs never have kids, ever. Meaning that passing it down onto a son or a daughter is actually exceedingly rare. And that in and of itself, if you've sworn an oath, may empower you to go, I need to have children to ensure that my oath can be fulfilled, which in and of itself creates some interesting stories. You're always looking for core conflicts.
From a human perspective, that is such a fucked up reason to have a kid. Like, I gotta make sure this oath gets resolved, better have kids.
But they're not human. And I
think
that's something
that's what I love about it, though.
Yeah, ditto, I agree. And I think that's one of the things that makes for super fascinating characters, is looking at their psychological makeup and saying, what can we do that makes things a bit different? It's super fun.
Watchdog 3079. Is there any mention of Bugman in the War of Vengeance? Not that I recall. His clan would have existed, because the Dragonback mines were already established by that point. But they would not have been very involved because the Dragonback clans were a long way from the front lines.
Yeah.
There were not. I mean, there were some Elven towers in the Badlands, according to the new Old World stuff. So they would have been involved, but it wasn't where like the ugly fighting was taking place, which was further up in the northern reaches around Bretonnia and the Empire.
Yeah. Yeah. Oh, yes to all of that. They almost certainly were involved in places. There'll be grudges that are sitting out there, probably outstanding, some of which have been passed down for almost countless generations. But broadly speaking, we have no real detail.
Necromancer Cobalt, I just looked up the model. What came first, the Pirate Goblin in Fantasy or the Red Gobbo in 40K?
Pirate Goblin.
Yep. There you go. So, the last thing I really wanted to talk about when it came to Bugman's Oath for today, because I do think it's really interesting, something to dial in on, is we've talked about how they're not slayers, but this Oath of Vengeance carries such a heavy weight. And one of the things that I find really, really interesting that you see a lot in the descriptions of Bugman's Rangers is that Bugman's Rangers, despite the fact they're not slayers and they're regular dwarfs, which means that, so the thing about slayers that we've talked about back in our slayer stream is that when you become a slayer, you're essentially dead for legal purposes. Many of these dwarf slayers will give up their clan name and won't ever really bring it up unless like they absolutely have to. And they, for all intents and purposes, they've been removed from that aspect of dwarf society. What's fascinating to me about the Oath of Vengeance is that for Bugman's Rangers and Bugman himself, they very much seem to, it doesn't directly state this, but the lines are indicating that they are basically giving up on their clan oaths to take this Oath of Vengeance as a higher priority, which if you know your dwarfs and you know how deeply fundamentally core clan oaths are, coming from Valea herself, to me, this could speak to a really fascinating story about the origin of the Oath of Vengeance and where it originates from. Of that, it is such a high priority oath that it, in some ways, causes a violation of other oaths that many dwarves
like
would
the
say.
Oath of the Slayer.
Yeah, which I think goes a long way to it. The thing that's fascinating is that when you see with Bugman's Rangers, they're the only ones that do not have, you would expect them to almost be like a unit of Bretonian knights, where you have like all these different dwarfs with all these different clans with clan symbols and stuff, but they don't. The identity as Rangers of Vengeance consumes in an almost really upsetting, grim way, just completely consumes their identity and leaves everything else behind. Of imagining that you have a clan, you hear word that there's a survivor of your family from a terrible attack, and you go, oh, thank God, so-and-so survived. Let's get them over here, and meeting them and realizing that they've taken this oath, and legally, in a legal specific sense, they are still alive. They still have all the rights and the holdings and everything else. But as far as they personally are concerned, they're dead to your family, which is a fascinating dichotomy, I think, compared to like slayers that are legally dead and could actually add in some really interesting issues of like in a roleplay scenario, if you have a ranger character that you're one of like if you take the Oath of Vengeance, you have family members who are hell bent on getting you back, and you are hell bent on not going back, and the clash that could create.
Yep, hurts. Dwarves have it tough.
Because I love those kinds of stories, like because especially that, you know, from especially with what we talked about earlier of imagine Bugman, and there are the other Bugman clans who family members who really would love for Bugman to come home, rebuild the tavern, take the family name even further beyond, restore them to riches beyond like they used to be when he was there before the family felt like they're doing okay, but they're not as successful as they were when he was around and brewing. And even if you go with the story where, say, within the first 10 years of this oath, he kills Git Guzzler, and they think, and there's that hope that maybe he'll be like, okay, I can go home now, but he just can't. He goes, nope, I've killed one tribe, on to the next. And there's no end in sight. And to me, for Bugman, I love the tragedy of Bugman, because from a very it's such a great opportunity of it's more subtle and sinister in a way than the Slayer Oath, of that it really slaps in the face of how humans would look at it of, oh, you got your revenge. That's the end of this book trilogy. Great read. Happily ever after time. Dwarfs don't do happily ever afters.
No, too
They
fat.
just don't. And it's completely self-inflicted, which is the worst part.
Yeah. Yeah, dwarfs are tough. And if you're out there going, ooh, they sound fun, they do make great player characters, but I have found that the majority of people who play dwarfs just play them as humans that are tough. And perhaps, sit in their shed and make stuff and tinker, and perhaps are a bit of an arse to play with because they decide, I'm going to be stubborn today. But dwarves are significantly deeper than this alone. And the general lore that sits around the oaths is a really good place to begin. But if you're out there looking to use someone like Josef Bugman as inspiration, I would generally suggest sit down and figure out what is the core psyche of your dwarf. And that means looking at what we as humans would see as divergent mental processes, but are normal for the dwarf. And then where does your dwarf lie beyond that? Because I, for example, lie beyond your standard human because I'm neurodivergent in a host of fun, exciting ways that I really love. And your dwarf might be neurodivergent for a dwarf. What does that mean? So Josef Bugman has focused in on his Oath of Vengeance, and he will never come back. Let's make that as clear as we possibly can. And that's not because he is neurodivergent. That's because he is normal for a dwarf. That's how dwarfs work. And if you're playing one, how do you manifest that kind of incredibly intractable thought process?
Good for Bullets asks, so do you think the Oath of Vengeance could become a cult like the Cult of Grimnir? So I would say, in my opinion, it would probably be part of the Cult of Grimnir.
I would suggest it isn't, because
really?
I would suggest it's almost certainly one of the other ancestor gods, and it's just never been written.
Yeah, because I can easily imagine that one of the first Oaths of Vengeance could have been against the dragons, or
for example.
Of that.
In fact, I think what we have here is a gap in the dwarfs, which is explaining how their cultural norms and their oaths are grounded in not just their psychology, but their mysticism and their religion, and how they express themselves. And we already have some significant depth added to the Oath of the Slayer because of the war game. And the war game focuses on slayers. And the roleplay game should have picked up that particular ball and run with it. But the people who've written the roleplay game have yet to do so. All they've done is gone, well, there's slayers, because there's loads of slayer stuff, and not really gone any further. I would suggest that almost certainly, if you were to write it up as cleanly as you could, there would be a god and a deep story, one of the ancestors' gods, and the Oath of Vengeance that they swore that the dwarves now replicate.
You know who I would do for this?
Absolutely wrapped up in that.
You know who I would do for this one? Is I would do the Oath of Vengeance being Morgrim, and being that the development of those war machines being part of that first Oath of Vengeance against the dragons, creating these horrifying weapons of war instead of creating like beautiful arcs of mastery and all this stuff, creating these terrible death-dealing war engines to kill dragons.
Yeah, I think all of that would definitely work.
But in any event, we've got a couple more super chats.
Yeah, you do, yeah. I'm just noticing you missed a couple there.
Yes, yeah. Holy Artist. So Josef Bugman is like Batman with an army of Robins. That is a way, I suppose, you could look very murderous Robins.
Yes. And by that I mean Batman is a freak. He goes far beyond what any normal human would ever do. And in some respects, that is the norm for a dwarf. And so Batman is just a normal dwarf responding to the world around him, and he's sworn his vengeance.
I actually love that more than I thought I would, even though I think that was kind of meant as like a cheeky comment, because I love the idea of like dwarfs hearing about someone picking up with Bugman and being like, oh shit, I can't believe he got involved with Bugman. Like his brews are so beloved, but hearing that someone in your family or one of your friends or something has got caught up in Bugman's madness and being like, God damn it. Like, like seeing how scary Bugman would be.
But having said that, though, to do that means that something has happened to that individual dwarf that made it a necessity.
True, but like, I almost wonder if there would be like, you could imagine like older dwarfs around younger dwarfs being like, "Don't go after Bugman." Like, seeing him on a battlefield, be like, "Stay away from them."
You realize if you swear this oath, you're never coming back. You won't ever be me, ever. You'll never become a Longbeard like I am. You'll never become respectable in your community because you're going to be out there night by night, living in horror, cold, wet, damp, chasing down the impossible for the rest of your life because you're swearing an oath that can never be fulfilled and you will never stop. It is a loss to the clan.
Yeah, it's like instead of building your trade here, instead of building up your horde, building up the clan's wealth and all this stuff, you're wasting your life. Oh man, there could be some really, that would be such a fun story because it's so different than that, because the Slayer Oath is such a, you're done, like you're just done. But the Oath of Vengeance has that fascinating wiggle room of, you could just imagine the heated arguments between like a dwarf and their kin about it, which would be so fascinating to me. Tyrant, who okay, so this is a little unrelated, but that's fine. Who would be a good loreful multiplayer duelist in Total War that have actually campaigned / working together, like Tamarkon and Thrazoth, the Ashen, or Greasus and Zalming? Just very quick ones off the top of my head. Elspeth von Draken you could do with Karl Franz or Gelt pretty easily. Katerin with Karl Franz, they had a thing where they helped each other a couple times. Just trying to run through some quick races in my head. The Changeling with literally anybody, I think, is technically fair. Fun things like Mazda Mundi you can actually do with some of the High Elves to represent some older times. Dark Elf characters can actually team up with a surprising amount of allies. Same thing for Manfred. Archon the Black and Kalita teamed up once. More people than you think will, kind of shack up together depending on circumstances, because things get complicated in the world. Bloodclaw Bob, how would other dwarfs react to a dwarf fulfilling a long-term / passed down oath? Like, would it be a fairly big time oath? Like a fairly big time oath. Love the show, guys. Keep on rocking. It would depend, I think, a little bit.
So it depends on the oath, obviously, but this is a day of clan celebration because something has been fulfilled. Now, obviously, I think an easy way for us to imagine this is, say, the Book of Grudges. The Book of Grudges is basically a ton of oaths where they have sworn to resolve in a fashion that feels like they have equaled the wrong done to them in the past. And as each of these oaths is fulfilled, it's generally damn fucking right it is. But every once in a while, there'll be something that's big. And that's worthy of celebration by the hold, by the clan, by the family, by whatever it may be. Now, if we're looking at a long-term passed down oath that has been fulfilled, depending upon the oath, it will range from, thank goodness that is over, let's just all go to bed now, to proper all-hold celebrations that this has finally come to an end and their honour is upheld. Because ultimately, all of their oaths all boil down to one thing, and that's their personal honour. That's their own personal view of themselves and how others view them in turn. And being able to do something that makes everybody go, you did the right thing, is ultimately very important to a dwarf. So if it's something that's on the more, I don't want to say light-hearted, but most certainly on the more celebratory side, then yes, a celebration will follow. But if it's something grim, if it's something dark, if it's something that has plagued the line for a long time, it might be nothing more than a release and perhaps even prayers and thanks to your ancestors for finally being able to resolve this very important, let's say, oath.
One of the things that I think that you would see happen that would be really cool to do in a roleplay campaign is that if a big oath like that got fulfilled, you would probably see the gathering of relevant parties. So whether it's just the clan or a hold, and then a Longbeard coming out and like telling the story of when it happened, like bringing out the archives, bringing out the big books and being like, this is when it happened, and detailing every step that's led up to this moment. It would probably last for a really long time, depending on the size of the oath. Might be days. And then it would probably be kind of melancholy, and then there'd probably be a giant fuck you drink party with music and everything at the end, depending on the appropriate mood.
Yeah, I completely agree. We are dealing with the sagas of the dwarves, and the dwarves do love their sagas, their big long tales, and discussing how the past influences the present, because they are always looking back. They're a traditional species. And harking back to Josef Bugman, we're not just looking at an individual who has his own oaths of vengeance, but he also has his own saga. Depending on the version we go with, as I said earlier, in second edition, he was literally one of the most storied dwarves of his generation because of the enormous amount that he had done through the course of his life, right down to just simple things like the Great Battle of Hangover Hill, so called because his entire dwarf ranger component were pissed out of their skulls, utterly drunk, and got ambushed by goblins, and not only twatted them in turn and killed them all, completely roundly destroyed them, then hunted them down to their own lairs, and that became part of the saga of Josef Bugman. And dwarf sagas and the repetition of what they've done before so that the next generation can learn from it and celebrate it is a core component of dwarf psyche. So in this exact circumstance, there would be, I think as Sotek very eloquently puts, long recitations from lore masters and those who understand the past of how they got into the position they were in, what they did to resolve it, and why it's now resolved, which is an important component of it, because finally they can move on.
Yeah, it'd actually probably be a very interesting and in some ways horrible thing to go through as a human, because you'd be sitting there for hours listening to this dwarf talk, and every once in a while the dwarves in the room would just go, "Hey!" or they'd grumble about something angrily, and you're just stuck there trying not to be rude for days.
It's almost like an episode of Lorebeards.
Yeah, basically. When are we getting to the point?
It's like an episode of Lorebeards.
I would love that as a GM. That'd be so funny, because you're like, for the human players, it's just how long could they go before they accidentally step on somebody's toes and piss somebody off?
Oh, it's gonna happen.
Which would be very funny. One turning leaf. What is a clan oath, and is there any sources we can look at for those? So a full-on clan oath? I think there might be one off the top of my head. I mean, a good example would be the Oath of Clan Drakebeard, which is the Ungrim Iron Fist clan Slayer Oath, which has been passed down from father to son, which sucks. Oh god, I want to say the Norgrimling clan has a notable oath about reclaiming Carrick Eight Peaks from the Skaven, and the clan Norgrimling is depressing. It is a very depressing clan.
And a lot of these, I think, could very easily be translated into, if we're looking to categorize the dwarfs into a host of separate oaths that have religious significance, a lot of those could just be simple oaths of vengeance.
Yeah.
That the clan itself has to see through.
Yeah, but you might also run into clans that have oaths about like maintaining like certain, like an oath of craftsmanship and such.
Absolutely.
Like the Krogbrow clan and their extremely obsessive relationship with engineering and like pushing the envelope when it comes to nautical and aircraft, which drives other engineers fucking crazy. But they're not going to stop.
Yeah.
So it would just depend on the nature of the clan. But vengeance would be like the most easy to showcase
and understand.
But there are others that might have like an oath of secrecy, where there's something that the clan keeps to themselves. Like actually a good example of, once again, if you go read, I think it's the Grudgebreaker storyline, there's, I don't want to get too much into specifics, but there is an oath of secrecy among one of the clans because there is a descendant of theirs who's still alive that's mutated, that was born a mutant, and the dwarves keep him alive, but that clan is sworn to the highest form of secrecy as an oath to like care for them, but never let anyone know. And it's a very important core component of that story, which is really tragic. Andres, I run a Wolfram campaign on one PC as potentially be a Grail Knight. How to deal with it? Good luck.
Okay, so yeah, Right, so first, becoming a Grail Knight is not a short process. This is not something that typically happens over the course of, say, 5 months or 6 months. This is normally something that forms part of an enormous and engaging quest, which needs to often have a point. As in, they achieve something, and thus the lady responds and provides the chalice from which the Grail Knight will be supping. So how would I deal with that? First, I would build a story that both speaks to the faith of the knight at hand, that faith being expressed, and some deed being done, and that deed in turn either being rewarded or recognized or something similar by the lady, and how she then in turn moves towards the Grail Knight. Now, how to deal with the Grail Knight being a Grail Knight in turn, that's big stuff and is not currently covered by the rules. Knights of the Grail for Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay 2nd Edition pretty much dodged this bullet and decided that they wouldn't deal with it with any proper rules. So you don't have anything beyond the fantasy battle game itself, and it got stuck at 6th edition. So in many respects, you can literally make anything up and you would probably still be closer to the truth.
Yeah, there's one thing I do want to add, which is I think one of the most important things that you see in like the really well-written Bretonnia books is dread. Make it very dreadful, because there's a lot of fear with the Grail, which is known that if you sup from the Grail and you are not completely pure of spirit, it will kill you instantly.
Dead. Yeah,
like you're instantly dead. So a lot of Grail Knights have horrible nightmares and anxiety about the Grail because they're constantly wondering, am I pure? Am I equal to it?
And I would potentially look at your PC and I would start asking those questions so that they can then look and go, am I even worthy of this? And if they're not, don't hold back.
Yeah, that's the real thing, is that you as the GM also need to be like, if you're going to realistically be like, I'm going to give someone the chance to drink from the Grail, A, make sure they have a fate point. Goodness. And I'm going to mute for a minute.
Someone clearly agrees. Yeah, so that being the case, the question you need to answer is, are they worthy of being Captain America? And I know that's a very Marvel way of approaching this, but Captain America is something that is beyond just a state of mind. Captain America, in terms of how he's presented, is almost perfect in terms of doing the right thing. And if your Grail Knight is not, they won't become one. So that's where I would definitely be starting. But in terms of actual rules, you need to build your own Captain America rules.
Yeah, and I would say if they're not scared, if they're not terrified of drinking the Grail, then you know.
Yeah, your PC should absolutely be uncertain about what they're doing. And if they're not uncertain, then I would suggest that you need to do some more work to ensure that they are uncertain.
Yeah. How, right, I know. How dare someone walk in front of our house? I know. Peter, how does Bugman feel having Rangers follow him on the oath? Ooh, would he feel guilt about it? Or is he so driven by his own oath he doesn't think about it? I think it would depend on his day-to-day, but I'm sure there would be guilt sometimes.
Yeah, dwarves are deep and complex people, and sometimes he will be 100% behind everything he's doing, so trammeled is his thoughts. But other days, he will be sitting, waxing melancholy at what he has done to these people who are now around him, who are all following him unto death. And that death will weigh heavily upon his soul. Other days, though, it just won't. And they absolutely are with him because they believe in what he's doing and what they're doing. They are all working towards that same goal. So it's one of those things that I think would vacillate. At some points be very strong, at other points be less so.
Andres asked, does Bugman like oaths pass on to one's progeny? Often, it would depend on the nature of the oath specifically.
Yeah, I think it would depend on the nature of the oath as well. But I do think that... I think that given the story as we have it, he would expect that if he had any, that they would. Now, obviously, given Age of Sigmar, it would suggest that he's have progeny. I would probably suggest that the proper way of handling that is that he doesn't know.
Yeah, I would agree. Yeah, I would say he didn't know.
And that if you really wanted to grip it tightly, you would say that he dies in some fashion before progeny are aware. Progeny become aware of the legacy that they have, and they carry on his purpose and carry his items and carry his stuff, and over the course of time it gets lost as the millennia pass by.
Cameo, speaking of Batman, I see some parallels between Eltharion and Joseph. Would be an interesting team up. They would get along, I think, better than most elves and dwarves, but they would be grim company. I would not want to be in the room.
Would be grim. I mean, Eltharion is literally the grim.
Yeah. They would be that would be the most unpleasant room to be in. Even if you are sympathetic to both of them, they would not be fun to be around.
Yeah, I agree.
Walking Tree, sorry for the big ass, but could you give a rundown of the dwarves' view on the other factions? I can give a super very brief one. I can't imagine them hating the Bretonnians, who also take their oaths very seriously, or lizards who escape them more than anything. So, okay, in a very realistic from the lore perspective, the dwarves don't know about every race in the Warhammer world. Like the lizardmen are a fairly mysterious thing dwarves don't really know about and don't care about. It's not really relevant to them. But Bretonnia, Empire, Kislev generally seem pretty favorably.
In fact, something that I said better. Empire, allies. Bretonnia, tolerated. Wood elves, fuck them. High elves, they're the fucking worst. Dark elves, they're just elves. Lizardmen, what the fuck? What else do we have? Cathay, yeah, they're over there. Chaos dwarves, fuck them. Chaos, fuck them. Anyone else?
Beastmen, fuck them.
Beastmen, fuck them.
Greenskins, fuck them. Skaven, fuck them.
Fuck them. Yeah, so broadly speaking, the dwarves stand on their own hill and require absolutely no one else. But because of Sigmar and the fact that his entire realm carries the burden of the oaths and expectations of Sigmar, the Empire is given this special dispensation as being, broadly speaking, allies. Other than that, the rest of them can probably get to fuck.
Yeah. Ogres can be a little... They're not reliable, but they can be useful from time to time.
Yeah, quite.
Yeah, Tomb Kings is usually a fuck 'em. Vampires...
Get the ends.
Yeah,
nope.
Vampires are a big fuck 'em.
Yeah, totally.
Yeah, they don't get along with a lot of people.
No, they don't. They're very stubborn people who very much stick with what they know.
Andres, I meant that Grey Knights are OP. That's a problem. Yes, they are. And,
it is, which is why I would be very keen to ensure that anything they get is absolutely secured fairly, because if it is, they're no longer OP because they would not use their powers outside of the right place to use their powers, which means that it no longer matters. Plus, many Grail Knights just protect their chapels. Who is this character? Why are they doing what they're doing? Because Grail Knights protect the land, protect Bretonnia. Is that what they're doing? If they're questing around and stuff, they're not Grail Knights, they're questing knights. Becoming a Grail Knight in Fantasy Roleplay 2nd edition meant pretty much retiring your character, and that very much might be what you're looking at. So I would suggest that the conversation with the player is the most important part. What are you looking out for from this? How do you see this developing? Because as it currently stands, you're heading towards a retirement of this character after supping from the lady's chalice, rudeness aside.
Gazelle 2021, and then I think we're done after that. Did the ancestor gods ever tell the dwarves they can't be inventive and experimental? Seems countered that they're engineering minds, while the Dawi's are embracing making weapons of mass destruction and sending fire for battle. So, no, it's not. That's not what it is. I think a lot of people get caught up in that misunderstanding of dwarves can't be inventive and experimental because there's a no. It's the dwarves have a very debatably overzealous desire and love to look back at the ancestors and see them as a pinnacle. And because of that, their dwarves have a very traditional society that often results in when you try and innovate, there is a careful line that has to be walked of that. First of all, the innovation needs to be proven that it is safe, which dwarf safety standards are very strict. And, you can think about human culture. When we invent new technology, it tends to kind of blow up in our face multiple times before we kind of figure it out. And for dwarves, that is intolerable. It blew up in your face? Well, then clearly it's too dangerous. What the hell were you thinking? Why do you think you're better than the ancestor? Why are you better than our traditions? We've been working just fine using with what we have. Why do you need to do something different? And there are times where a dwarf will say, I have figured out a better method. I have proven it is safe over the course of 200 plus years. and I have perfected my method, and all the dwarves look at it and go, well, okay, maybe, okay. Sometimes they discover something the ancestor did a really long time ago, and they just forgot about it. And they rediscover it and go, oh, damn, this is really powerful. This is really notable, and the ancestor said it works. Great, so it works. But for me personally, I blame a lot of this on the battle game writing, which would often kind of give the dwarfs like a myriad of war machines and then do a really shit job of explaining how dwarfs do anything. And it led to this really confusing thing where it's like, well, why don't the dwarfs use pikes and spears? And the realistic answer is that Games Workshop looked at it and went, well, we don't like our dwarfs with pikes and spears, so they're not going to have pikes and spears.
Yeah. So my one on this is, again, about dwarf psyche. In the beginning, everything was perfect. And then chaos came. And as every generation passed on, it became worse. And whilst there may be peaks and there may be dips in terms of the overall capability of the dwarfs at different times, there is nothing that will compare to the purity of what started everything off. The ancestors, right at the very beginning, are perfect. And this is something that is very clear in many historic societies as well, where they believed that at the beginning things were perfect and they got worse over time. I'm going to bring out one of the most obvious examples of that. Adam and Eve. They let Adam live for almost 1,000 years. And then as each generation moved on from that, the lifespans dropped and dropped and dropped and dropped, if you go by the typical generations. Because in the beginning, things were perfect, because perfection lay at the source of creation. And the further you get from the source of creation, the worse things get. And that lies at the heart of much dwarf writing for many writers. Perfection lay at the beginning, and the further you get from that, the weaker you get. Now, some dwarves will look at that and say, well, we need to do more to make up for our imperfections, which means that some of them will attempt to innovate. Others, and the majority, it must be said, will look back to the past as the source of everything as it should be. At the golden age, perhaps even before the golden age, when dwarves were at their best, when the ancestors were still alive, that is when things were right in the world. And now they're not. And all of this new innovation is nothing more than chaos. Actual, literal chaos being imposed upon dwarves and taking them away from what they should be. There is very real cultural issues here, where some dwarves will look at it and say, no, I have a better answer, an actual better answer. Burlock Damonson, he's a perfect example of this. I can do this better. To which the other dwarves will say, no, you can't, you arrogant, young bearded idiot. Our ancestors know how to do this. This is how you make a cannon. This is how you make a flamethrower. This is how you make a gyrocopter. Why would you mess with that? You are messing with the perfection of the ancestors. You're doing it wrong. And we will get real conflict. So the answer to your question isn't that they don't do it. They absolutely do. But that it causes deep cultural issues for them when they do so. Because there's this abiding belief that the past is better than the present. Tradition stands over innovation. Conservatism is much more important than developing into something new because of the way that dwarves think. And I think that this is easy if you want to do some research to go find in a host of different societies in the past, because the Platonic idea of something perfect at the beginning and then emanating outwards from this source of perfection into something that's no longer perfect stands in many ancient philosophies. And the dwarves, in some respects, espouse this at their core. But as we've discussed already in multiple points of this stream and others, every time we say this is the case, there's going to be 1,000 examples where it isn't. Some dwarves will go in different directions. Some dwarves will innovate. Some dwarves will leave the guilds behind because they think that they are lost in the past and they can do better. You got to remember that dwarves they're not just simply represented by the Karakan Corps, the Great Dwarf Empire. You also have expatriate dwarves who are entirely grounded into the civilizations they live in. There's tons of dwarves in the Empire who live like imperial citizens and have abandoned much of what is considered to be core dwarf practices, but they still have a dwarf psyche, and that dwarf psyche makes them obsessive, makes them concentrate in particular tracks. Consider them all like mine carts moving along rails. They're all going to go in that direction, but how they go in that direction according to society around them will be different. So the answer is kind of yeah, but at the same point, absolutely not. There's tons of dwarves who do things differently, which is a long-winded way of replying to that one.
No, I think that was a great way to put it, though. Watchdog, how big was the oath sworn upon Neferata when she took Silver Pinnacle? Well, that would be a grudge rather than an oath. But
grudge. But in many respects, grudges are like oaths as well. And
true.
The answer to that one is there are multiple clans who will be looking to see this one resolved. And I think in some respects, it speaks to sometimes the Games Workshop writers not quite realizing what they've created. And by that I mean there are going to be thousands of dwarfs who are dedicated to this.
Yeah,
that doesn't happen.
Yeah, the Silver Pinnacle was one of probably the biggest blind spots in GW writing when it came to the dwarfs. Because in the grand scheme of the world, from a dwarf perspective, it wasn't that long ago. And it was right on their fucking doorstep. It's one of those things that I actually remember being irritated by this when I was doing studies on Neferata lore many years ago. I was so irritated by the lack of the dwarven perspective on her, because she would be like, they treat the vampire counts of the von Karsteins like they're the vampires that initially pissed the dwarfs off, which is ridiculous. Neferata taking the Silver Pinnacle would have been the thing the dwarfs would have been like, fuck all vampires, kill them on sight, the bastards.
Yeah, agreed completely. And there is often holes in the thought processes of some of the writers, because often one writer writes something here, another writer writes something there, another one writes something here, and nobody has just sat down and linked each part together. And it's something that I think Gav Thorpe back in the day did a relatively good job with, because he was Loremaster for Warhammer, and he thought about all of Warhammer and went, crap, I'm going to have to make this all make sense together. But there isn't really anyone that does that anymore. And because of that, we're left with islands of lore that should be linked together with strong trade routes. But the prevailing winds have apparently separated them entirely.
Simon the Emperor says, the one time two clans forgot why they hated each other and agreed to mutually forgive the grudges against each other. Was that actually divine punishment from the ancestors, or just a very dark cosmic coincidence / joke? So this is one of those I would because a mountain proceeded to fall on both the clans and wipe them both out. Probably a little, mostly probably B, but there might be some weirdness in there.
Yeah, that one actually sounds more like a moral tale rather than something that happened, as in something you'd expect to find in Warhammer Monthly or something equivalent, rather than something that actually, strictly speaking, happened exactly like that. Something that would be a cautionary tale for one dwarf to tell another dwarf to tell another dwarf.
Yeah, I feel like that would be
of holding on to the past and understanding why you hate that person. It's absolutely essential that you understand why. And I'm going to lay out why this actual situation is impossible. Actually impossible by the way dwarfs work. So, for example, I hate you. And the first question is, why? And dwarfs answer that every single time, which means that they can't forget it. They have great tomes of lore where they explain why they hate everyone else. The idea that two clans could forget why they hate each other is so undwarfen to almost be nothing more than a myth, rather than something that actually happens.
That is a parable. That's like a dwarf explained to a beardling, this is why it's so important you remember your oaths, because if you don't, the literal mountains will crumble around us.
Yeah, that's exactly how it feels. And it makes a beautiful one. I think that makes for a beautiful story. It's the sort of thing that I would add as a box in the corner of a book somewhere and say, this is a thing that dwarfs say. But that's not because I would say that's a thing that had happened. I would say that's because it's a thing that they believe would happen if, for example, you handled your oaths like a human. Where, you know, a generation or two later, no one knows why they're doing what they're doing. They just hate them over there. Why? Because they do. And if anything, most dwarfs really dislike the idea of fighting against other dwarfs anyway, because it gets a little bit too close to kinslaying.
Yeah, it's very rare that it goes to violence. Normally,
totally.
there are dwarves in every kingdom whose literal job is to deal with that.
Yep.
To like sort the grudges between clans. But we are way over time.
That was a good one. I wouldn't mind giving a quick summary on this one. It'll be super short.
Go ahead.
My summary is Josef Bugman is a character that started in first edition Warhammer. You can't get older, and has survived not just through to the end of Warhammer and having an impact on the end times, but also directly into Age of Sigmar also. And that's beautiful because we've got a character that spans all of Warhammer. But Josef Bugman is also something more than that, because it's a character that can teach us that the dwarves are much more than Warhammer has perhaps already described. And we've covered that in this stream to some extent, in that it's quite clear that oaths and dwarves are fundamental. Absolutely fundamental. But that has never really been properly expressed in the rules for either dwarves in the war game, where we get slayers and how their oaths have changed their rules, and that's about it. But the roleplay game, where normally these things are massively expanded upon and deeply, deeply developed, it's never occurred. And Josef Bugman is a perfect example of a character that says, look, here is some development you could do, because we have a character that speaks to the depth that an oath of vengeance means, and also the implications for all the other oaths of vengeance that you can see in other manifestations of the dwarfs in a host of different novels.
Castle of Dragon Tamer.
Quite. And there is a hole in the, let's say, not just the rules, but the entirety of what the dwarves are in terms of their expressions in games. And that would be super fun to explore. So Josef Bugman, to me, is not only a brilliant character because he's been there from the beginning, and he's right there at the end, and he is fundamental into just the basics of living in Warhammer. Hey, I can get a beer. But he's also important because he speaks to us about how we can look at dwarfs or the species of Warhammer as a whole and learn more from them by not just examining what they are today, but looking right back to where they originally started and saying, there's more we can do here to make Warhammer a bigger, deeper, and most importantly, no longer Tolkien-inspired setting. Because in this particular case, Warhammer dwarves are far beyond anything Tolkien expressed for his dwarves. For all, if you were to screw your eyes up, they appear to be identical.
And with that, we are at the end of today's stream. The first Sunday stream for 2025. What a way to kick it off.
Yay! That was a good one.
Yeah, we will
What are we
be
going to
back.
do next time?
I don't know yet.
Let's find out after the stream, so you won't find out until we decide to tell you afterwards.
Yeah, so there will be something this Wednesday. I don't know what yet. And there will be something this upcoming Sunday. I don't know what yet. So we might do a vote. We might not, depending on that, because the Sunday after that will be the Sotek birthday stream where I'm going to pick the subject. So
That's a good point.
So for next week, we might just, I don't know. We'll figure it out. But yeah, thank you all very, very much for watching. We hope you had a lovely time. If you haven't already, LAWhammer should hopefully be back this upcoming week. So
God, I hope it is. I would just like to say I've got a lot of work for whatever the next stream is. If it doesn't get done, I'm just going to cry. This Friday, fucking hell, we're going to be playing.
Yeah, and the next Wednesday stream will be on my channel here, but the next Sunday stream will be on Andy's channel. So hope you all have. Oh, that's right. We said we were going to do Arball. That's what it was. We said we were going to do that. I remember that. So yeah, sure. Why not? Arball the Undefeated next week. Sure.
Arball next week. Woo! Okay, so if you want to watch about Arball the Undefeated, Khorne's favored champion of kick-ass, come with us next Sunday and learn all of his unexpected lore.
I don't know. Are we going to be able to get 3 hours out of Arball? That'll be interesting.
Oh, yeah.
Anyway. Okay. If he feels like confident about it, then great, awesome. Anyway, we'll see y'all for that. Thank you for reminding me of that, Hugh. Who was? I don't know who that was.
I was Hawk, I think.
Thank you.
It was Hawk.
Thank you.
Thanks, Hawk.
Also, hello, Hugh. Hope you're doing well. That's why I saw your name. Anyway, so we're out of here because we're way over time. We'll see you guys later. Check out Please subscribe to LAWhammer and Loremaster of Sotek YouTube channels, whatever. Bye. Bye, Darth Eats. Yes, bye, Darth Eats. Okay, get out of here. Bye.
See y'all later.